Here now, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And hello to you who are joining online. Welcome to the 2026 Paleoclimate Working Group meeting.
Esther, you have to know. Oh, she knows. I'll probably do the same thing.
First, code of conduct. Please help us create a respectful and inclusive environment. And for speakers, you have 20 minutes for your talk, including ideally 5 minutes for question and answer. I will give you a reminder at 15 minutes. And for people who are joining online, you can use raise hand or chat function. For people who are joining in the room, please raise your hand and introduce yourself before your question. And for people who are here, if you have your laptop, you may join Google Meet in companion mode, so you can view slides better in details because the screen is kind of small here. And make sure to mute your speakers. Wireless, use Yuka Visitor. Okay, here is the agenda for today. We have refreshments outside, a lot of snacks, coffee, tea, sparkling water. Please feel free to go out, grab some at any time. Credit arrow here. And we have a morning break at 10:45 a.m. Then we start our CGD seminar, which is part of this working group meeting. And Victoria will give us a presentation on Green Sahara. And that will be in the main seminar room. And for people who are joining online, you need to switch to YouTube, so CGD channel to watch the CGD seminar. And if you have questions for Victoria, you can type that using Slido. I will give you some instructions later as well. And the lunch, we have reserved tables in the cafeteria for people who are joining in person. We can enjoy lunch together. And we will reconvene here in this room at 1 p.m. And the meeting adjourn at roughly 3:15. See how well we can manage the time. And if there's an interest, we can go to Southern Sun for a happy hour after the meeting, if there's an interest. Here is a floor map. We are in the Damon room, men's restroom, women's restroom. And the main seminar room is on the first floor. Okay.
Get an email.
Okay, our first speaker is Elena.
Okay.
Thank you for.
Well, hello, everyone. I'll try to keep to 15 minutes, maybe less. And I'm going to talk about some exploring I have done with the Southern Ocean and its capacity to uptake and draw down CO2 as its major carbon sink. We know it's Earth's major carbon sink. So the Southern Ocean accounts for about 40 to 44% of global ocean anthropogenic CO2 uptake, mostly through physical processes and water mass formation and subduction. And this upper ocean stratification regulates the carbon sequestration efficiency. And here I see Keith. I must emphasize that I'm talking about physical process only, okay, on the impact of the Southern Ocean as a carbon sink. So, well, I'm going to focus on stratification because it regulates carbon sequestration efficiency because it acts as a vertical mixing physical barrier. And it controls depth and volume ventilated waters, or the communication of these water masses with the atmosphere and its ability to carry CO2 into the deep ocean. What do we know? Stratification has increased about 8% in the Southern Ocean since the 1960s, and it's the strongest regional rate of, with the future projections suggesting that this will increase by 2100, sorry. So here we have, the changes in stratification, and we're going to see we measure it by the Brunt-Väisälä frequency, and we can see the change and that it is increasing. So odds show it's increasing, model results show it's increasing. But what I'm after is sort of an attribution challenge. So at high latitudes, what changes stratification? It comes mostly from two drivers: the hydrological cycle, and here I'm going to talk a lot about, or mostly about, precipitation, and cryospheric processes, such as ice melt, freshwater fluxes, and which are much more uncertain, particularly, in OBS and in models. So that's a big problem. So our Earth system models, they vary widely in how they treat this ice sheet ocean interaction. So it's very difficult to attribute observed changes to specific mechanisms. Okay, so my research question, and I'm going to come back to that, is can precipitation alone drive stratification changes strong enough, that will impact this role of the Southern Ocean as a CO2 sink? So that's the question. So if rainfall, precipitation can produce changes in stratification, the current projections might be capturing the dominant mechanism despite missing all the cryospheric processes. So it's like a lower bound on what could be happening. That's what I'm going to address. So, just to show some odds, like precipitation is increasing over the Southern Ocean. And when I talked about, why am I showing this? Because when I talk to people about the fact that I'm looking only at precipitation, people know you should look at P minus C and so on. So I put these plots on to show that in the Southern Ocean, especially if we look at this one on the right, the annual PPT by Bromwich, we can see that, he separates the P minus C. And if you look at the magnitude of precipitation, it's, much more than evaporation. And it's actually very positive, and it's increasing in the Southern Ocean. So this is just to satisfy the fact that I'm looking only at precipitation. Okay. So because, people, why didn't you look at P minus C? No, because I'm, in the Southern Ocean, P is sufficient. Well, and how I'm going to address this, I think the Pliocene is a period that it's, an analog for today. It has these experiments, the Pliomet 2 experiments have reduced ice sheets, have warmer equilibrium states, and they have something very important for what I'm trying to address, that they have no prescribed meltwater flux. So this isolates the atmospheric processes from the cryospheric process. Remember, I'm trying to find out if precipitation alone can change the ability of the Southern Ocean to be an effective and efficient CO2 sink. So I can separate CO2 forcing from climate state effects at fixed CO2. So I'm going to compare with pre-industrial, and I have 6 simulations, 2 climate states, Pliocene-like, pre-industrial, and 3 CO2 levels. So I got 280, 400, and 560, which is doubling. Okay, so I'm going to focus a lot on this doubling CO2. And the model I'm using here is EC Earth. It's developed by the group in Sweden. And so I'll be able to separate these effects and maybe come to an answer if precipitation alone can actually impact on stratification. So the PI uses modern topography, ice sheets and orbital, orbital parameters. Pliocene have reduced ice sheets as modified vegetation, close Bering Strait, and orbital parameters of the time period. No prescribed meltwater fluxes and the different levels of CO2. So this is the data I'm going to be presenting. What's my rationale? Very simple. Atmospheric warming, we're looking at different climate states, increased water vapor, increased rainfall, surface freshening, which increases stratification. And the bottom line is you got reduced CO2 uptake capacity. Okay, it's very simple rationale. Let's see if my results show that. I have to quantify. How do I quantify stratification? I use the Brundt-Weisshaller frequency and square, which measures exactly ocean resistance to vertical mixing. It reflects vertical density gradients created by temperature and salinity in the Southern Ocean. And we can see that, if it increases, higher N square values mean stronger stratification. So it's a stronger resistance to vertical mixing, which means less drawdown of CO2 into the deeper ocean. So that's our main quantity. Now, let's look at some results. So these are upper ocean spatial patterns for the different CO2 level columns and climate states, which are the rows. So it's a very busy plot, and so bear with me. So we have three variables: precipitation on the left, salinity in the middle, and N square, the 200 meters mean in the right. And the top column is the top row. The top row is the pre-industrial results. The bottom row are for the results for the Pliocene. I highlighted, with these ellipses, the dashed ellipses, the CO2 level, the most CO2, and in all the variables. And we can see, across the climate states and across the different CO2 levels that we have increase in precipitation, decrease in salinity, and increase in N square, which is a vertical mixing. So basically, we're looking at two things: different CO2 levels in the same climate and same CO2 at different climate states. It's a little confusing, but I'll try to walk you through it, okay? So now here's the filet mignon of the results. So what are the different CO2 levels showing? And if you can see in the slide, I highlighted when the CO2 is doubled, okay? Top row, pre-industrial. Bottom row, Pliocene. So it's within the pre-industrial, what happens if we double CO2? And within the Pliocene, what happens if we double CO2 from 280 to 250 in Pliocene-like conditions, and in the top row in the pre-industrial conditions? And it's very clear that with the increase in CO2, and we can look at the other CO2 levels and the climate states, we always have enhanced precipitation. And the enhanced precipitation is associated with enhanced freshening. And we can see for both PI and the Pliocene, and particularly when we double the CO2, but you can see it across all CO2 differences. So, but that doesn't mean that I'm changing stratification. I'm just saying that, more fresh water, more rainfall leads to freshening in the ocean. Now let's look at the vertical structures, and that is really cool. So here I present vertical profiles of these zonal mean salinity differences for the Southern Ocean. So that's we can see. Hardly you can see the axis, the depth, and the latitude by latitude. And to the right, 35 south, and we go all the way to 75 south. And we can see clearly that even in depth, or for the 400 meters, we can see a clear freshening. The blue colors are freshening, and the yellow colors are getting more saline. So the differences. So again, top row, pre-industrial, bottom row, Pliocene, and this on your right is the climate state differences for the same level of CO2. So the Pliocene is fresher. So the warmer climate is always fresher, and you see the same general pattern across the different CO2 levels, which is broader, freshening, and it, might reach more with respect to depth, with an increase with the depth differences with increase in CO2. And finally, like the quantification of this freshening rainfall, making the ocean fresher, is it enough to change the, vertical mixing or the profiles of N square? So what we see is yes, we can see that the maximum stratification is mostly in the upper 200 meters, and we see that this surface N square increases by about 20 to 40% with the CO2 doubling. And, we have particularly enhanced stratification along the Drake Passage, which is between like 52 and 62 degrees south. And we see the same thing for the climate state differences, stronger stratification, greater resistance to vertical mixing. So I can assume that we'll have more difficulty to, draw down CO2. So answering the question, from the beginning is, can precipitation alone reshape the carbon sink? And the, question is, at least in these experiments with the EC Earth model, the answer is yes. So precipitation dominates the surface freshwater budget, particularly in the 50-65 South storm track region. And what I forgot to say, but you noticed in the maps that I showed you, I did circle the 50 degrees south latitude, so we could see that everything within that latitude towards Antarctica, we could see was intensifying, the freshening, more rainfall, and more stratification. So, I do believe that rainfall is a reliable indicator of these changes in net freshwater forcing. And, this dominance of the precipitation, again, I got so much criticism, when I talked about precipitation alone, but it is supported about, many obs shows that. So these results exclude meltwater contributions, and they provide a good conservative lower bound of what can happen in the future. So in the future, the Southern Ocean might not be as efficient as a carbon sink. So my conclusions are, yes, hydrological cycle, or should I say the water cycle, is a very important driver. 10 to 20% precipitation increase will lead to a surface freshening in the 50-65 south band. The stratification strengthened as a result of this freshening. Also, the upper ocean is affected with a maximum response at about 50 to 100 meters depth. That's the maximum response. And the CO2 doubling produces, and this is surprising, a 20 to 40% increase in N square, or the resistance to the vertical mixing. So we have different forcing pathways emerging here. So you have a CO2 forcing versus a climate state transition, where we have the fixed CO2, and the implications for the Pliocene, the PI differences, the lack of the continental ice sheets. And then, I didn't explore this, but some other papers did, but could have impacts on radiation, sea ice coverage, and things like that, would change freshening and rainfall, etc. And then, of course, ventilation and CO2 uptake decline. And I didn't show, but it's something I'm working on, that these isopycnos show, they become less dense, and we suppress a lot of the mold water and Antarctic intermediate water subduction and weakening, which is the physical process where this vertical mixing or communication with the atmosphere takes place. So finally, as stratification strengthens, the ocean capacity to absorb atmospheric CO2 weakens, which potentially accelerates the atmospheric accumulation, which might have, consequences. So thank you.
Perfect timing. Great talk. Questions?
Last question. So is that possible you can compare with the paleoproteins whether this estimation of the reduction of CO2 absorption by the ocean reduced purely by precipitation itself is actually 50% of the proxy or 100% of the proxy record?
Well, okay. There was a recent paper where they did a multi-model study of this ClioNet 2 results. And they look more at the climate state, the difference between Pliocene and pre-industrial for the same levels of CO2. They claim that the ice sheet reduction is responsible for about 50%. So I would say then by exclusion that the hydrological cycle would be the other half.
Natalie, you have a question?
Hi, yes, thank you for the interesting talk. My question was more or less how long were the simulations run for?
I think they're like, well, I looked at 100 years. Okay, so these are 100-year means, but I think they were run for 500.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, the paper I think is Howers it's the climate CP. It just was released 2025. She ran the simulations.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I was just kind of wondering in terms of equilibration of the deep ocean, if you might expect this the stratification signal to evolve with time if the simulation was run longer.
Well, I think you got a point, but since I'm looking at the upper 400 meters, I think I'm okay. I'm safe, even if there might be some issues with the deep, I think, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Interesting talk.
Hunter?
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. When you say that the ice sheets were reduced, by how much to get such a strong importance?
By how much? Because I don't know. Betty, help me here.
Did they remove waste or like?
Yeah, pretty much.
They were supposed to remove waste and replace it by ocean. I don't know if they did in EC or, but they did make it no ice sheet. Some people just leave it as left.
Yeah.
And so does it mean by doing this reduction, they put all of this fresh water into the ocean?
No.
Okay.
See, that's the point. It's a perfect experiment. Yes.
So are there proxy records that we could compare to for in terms of salinity or some indication of mixing?
I'm looking into that.
Okay.
I have a colleague that did some Delta C13 for pre-industrial and from back, from 4 amps or something. And I'm trying to make some sense. And she noticed some differences, but I don't know if it goes back, but that's an important thing. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, but I think I will talk to you later.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Okay. I left my coffee somewhere.
For friends just joining us a while ago, we have Wi-Fi UCAR guest. Yeah. And okay.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, let's move on to our next talk. Michelle, I will stop sharing my screen.
Hello.
No.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So do you want me to pull up my slides, or are you going to pull them up from the Google?
How about you try to share yours first? I do have
Okay.
a backup.
Okay.
Backup. Michelle's talk is about isolating the climate response to West Antarctic ice sheet loss and the Northern Hemisphere vegetation changes of the mid-Pliocene.
Um, sorry, is this working or?
Yes.
Okay. Infinity mirror. Oops.
Yeah, just click your slides.
Maybe I should just share the window rather than the whole screen, right? There we go.
Yeah.
Should I just play the? Can you see that now?
It's pretty small. I have your slide open. I can also share mine.
Oh, let me. Should
Oh, it's better now.
is it better?
Yeah, can you go to full screen view?
Slideshow.
Yeah, slideshow.
Does this work now? I can't see anyone now. Is the thing.
It's not in slideshow.
Use now.
In the bottom of the PowerPoint, there's this.
Maybe you can show the whole.
Do it in the
screen,
top,
so just
Can you
present
do it in the top? Yeah.
You should be able to.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's fine. How about I share your slides from here?
Okay, I might have to cue you on the transitions.
Yeah, no problem. I have yours open.
Sorry about that.
Oh, don't worry.
Always happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, great. Now I can see your faces a little bit, which is a bit better than talking to just my own slides. Okay, yeah, as Zhang already said, I'll be talking to you about isolating the climate response to West Antarctic ice sheet loss, and as well as Northern Hemisphere vegetation changes of the mid-Pliocene. And this is work that I've completed in collaboration with my new postdoc advisor, Ran Feng, at the University of Connecticut, and my PhD advisor from the University of Washington, Kyle Armour. Okay, to get started, I might start my timer here. So as we all know, the mid-Pliocene has been widely used as an analog for future warming. That's because surface temperatures were around 3 to 4 degrees above the pre-industrial, and CO2 concentrations were similar to today's. That said, there are some key paleo-environmental differences between the Pliocene and the modern day climate. And maybe you could advance all of this animation, Zhang, here a couple times. But we've got some key topographical differences, such as the closure of the Bering Strait, the Canadian Arctic archipelago, a large reduction in the Greenland ice sheet, as well as a complete absence of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and widespread vegetation changes, which are more or less confined to the Northern Hemisphere. Next slide. So in CSM2 simulations, these boundary conditions, which I'm going to use that word boundary conditions to refer to all of these paleoenvironmental differences. They've been shown to have a large effect on global temperature in fully coupled simulations. In Paleoclimate, for example, CSM2 produced about 5 degrees of global surface temperature change with the full suite of boundary conditions and CO2 forcing. Next, 2 and forward maybe, with more than half of that arising just from the boundary conditions. So at pre-industrial levels of CO2, we still obtain almost 3 degrees of global surface temperature change in CSM2. Forward, please. And I want to particularly focus on Southern Ocean warming here because the boundary conditions alone show quite a bit of Southern Ocean as well as subtropical Pacific warming without much radiative forcing. So that little figure at the bottom is showing our estimate of the effective radiative forcing from fixed SST atmosphere only simulations in CAM6. Forward. Okay, so because we see the Southern Ocean warming without much radiative forcing, as well as the subtropical response, this prompts a closer examination on the effect of the West Antarctic ice sheet on the global ocean and the climate. And this is because there aren't a lot of other significant paleoenvironmental differences in the Southern Hemisphere in the mid-Pliocene, apart from this substantial ice sheet loss. So my goals for this research are twofold, and that's first to isolate the ice sheet as a potential driver of mid-Pliocene warming, and second to investigate this coupled climate response to those features, or rather that singular feature of the climate that may be expected to occur in the long-term response to greenhouse gas forcing. Next slide. So most of you are probably already aware that the West Antarctic ice sheet is highly unstable, and it is under an imminent threat of ablation with global warming, with some studies suggesting that the largest glaciers of the ice sheet may collapse within centuries, and the entirety of the ice sheet could collapse over the course of a millennium. Next slide. So a lot of research has been done to understand why the ice sheet is melting, and that's a whole separate field of like ice sheet instabilities and ice cliff instabilities and that sort of thing, as well as the oceanography work. But I'm interested in the climate response once the ice sheet is already gone. And there has been some work done on this topic, but most of these have only looked at the topographic change of the ice sheet. So as Ilana was saying earlier, it's like it's a lowering of the ice sheet. And for example, that was done in slab ocean simulations by Eric Steig in 2015 and Andrew Pauling and others in 2023. Next slide. But I argue that isolating really fully evaluating the climate response to a loss of the ice sheet in the context of both the past climate and future climate requires this bathymetric and land sea mass change as well. So what I've done here is I have investigated this in a single forcing CSM2 simulation run at 1 degree resolution, where only the ice sheet is changed, and I've removed it in both its topographic height as well as its ocean extent. So essentially, in that red half circle is showing where I've taken the pre-industrial topography and bathymetry and replaced it with that of the mid-Pliocene. And that's really similar to what we might expect with a full loss of the ice sheet in future. So as in the bedrock of the pre-industrial is pretty similar. Okay, next slide. So what we find, we've run the simulation for 400 years, and there's a gradual change from the beginning to the end of the simulation with the first 50 years showing the Southern Ocean and subtropical cooling response. And we think that that's probably due to this topographic anomaly. So Eric Steig, for example, talked about in his slab ocean simulation that this lowering effect creates a local cyclonic wind anomaly, and that affects polar air northward. And we're also seeing a strengthening of subtropical Pacific westerlies, which we think is what's causing this cooling signature. But over time, that cooling erodes and we get Southern Ocean warming in the Pacific sector of the Southern Ocean. And we're also seeing some subtropical warming as well. Next slide, please. And I argue that this is not an atmospheric response, but rather an ocean dynamical response. And that's because we ran the exact same simulation in a slab ocean model or slab ocean version of CSM2. And slab is a bit of a misnomer because that suggests it's not active, but there are ocean dynamics, so just fixed to the pre-industrial control state. So ocean heat transport is climatological. It's not able to change. So the slab ocean model gives us that atmospheric effect of the forcing that we've applied. So on the right here is our slab ocean results, and we can see that that cooling signature is maintained in the slab ocean model, and it does have a little bit of a negative IPO-like signature, but in any case, that Southern Ocean cooling and equatorial Pacific cooling, we can surmise that the warming we see in the fully coupled model is really due to the ocean dynamical response that's absent in this slab ocean model. Forward one. Yeah, and I don't know if you're probably all familiar with this field of research in this SST pattern effect, particularly perhaps Yue Dong's work, where she argues for a causal mechanism that's kind of the reverse of what we might normally think about when we think about equatorial Pacific and Southern Ocean teleconnections. So this is a Southern Ocean driven response where cooling in that region is advected through the climatological winds, and that cooling is then enhanced in the subtropics through the wind evaporative SST feedback. And I won't go into too much more detail about that, but there's some nice slab ocean simulations that argue for that causal mechanism in Yue Dong's work. Okay, forward, please. Okay, so back to this ocean dynamical response. So this top figure is showing the very slow evolution of Southern Ocean surface temperatures in the simulation. It doesn't look like much of a trend. I would argue that it's consistent with the millennial scale adjustment that we know is required for the Southern Ocean. These are 1,000 multi-millennial ventilation timescales, so we don't really expect it to increase very rapidly, although it is a caveat that maybe that trend might be flattening out, but with 400 years and 1 degree resolution, that's what we figured was sufficient for this work. But in any case, we think that's driven through a change in heat transport, as I argued, and for example, between the first 50 years of the simulation, yeah, thank you, Jean, for highlighting it, the southward heat transport anomaly is quite small. So like south of 60 degrees south, it's positive. But then if you move forward one, I'm just showing the last 50 years where it doesn't quite approximate the southward heat transport anomaly that we see in our full suite of boundary conditions, but it is definitely it's negative, but is a negative northward heat transport anomaly, so a southward heat transport anomaly. And because it's confined to a rather small surface area, it does represent quite a large amount of heat transport into the high southern latitudes. Okay, next slide. So how does this compare to vegetation? Well, and I'm also including the Greenland ice sheet changes there to kind of cover the remaining boundary conditions. If you move forward one slide, please. You can see that the effective radius of forcing is quite large from the vegetation. So it's all those big positive values over the Bering Strait in Canada, for example. Next slide. And what we find from this is that this asymmetric forcing leads to a net southward atmospheric energy transport. And so The mechanism for this is, I think it's been probably widely referenced in the literature, but essentially, if you have a surplus of energy in one hemisphere at the top of atmosphere, then this requires net southward cross-equatorial energy transport. And this is accomplished through a northward shift of the ITZZ, which we can see through in this bottom figure here that our vegetation and Greenland ice sheet forcing alone really does shift the ITZZ northward. And because the winds are stronger south of the equator in the climatological mean, that means that northward shift enhances the winds that are on the equator. And we posit that that is what is causing this cooling signature in the equator, which I'll show next. Next slide. Yeah, so this figure at upper right shows the last 30 years of this. It is, albeit it's a short simulation, it's 100 years, but this is the last 30 years, and we have a cooling anomaly that shows up along the equator in the subtropical Pacific, and it also extends into the Southern Ocean. And next slide, or next, yeah, animation. Sorry, go back. Thanks. And we're arguing that this is a more traditional mechanism of that teleconnection, where the tropical Pacific is leading the Southern Ocean temperature change, and that might be through the like a Rossby wave train mechanism, for example, through like excitation of these Rossby waves that are then propagated north and south. And just to compare that to our wave simulation, we can see that that's really a much different SST pattern, and the absence of the waves definitely is giving us something that looks a bit more like the SST pattern that we saw with the full suite of boundary conditions. Next slide. Just a bit further evidence that this is an atmospheric response. We did the same simulation again in the slab ocean mode of CSM2, and we see that in compare, like, sorry, to compare to the fully coupled model, it does seem that ocean heat transport, instead of amplifying warming, is actually damping global warming here. And that makes sense because the oceans here can move excess heat away from the northern hemisphere and redistribute it a bit better than can be done in the slab ocean model. And we might also see that enhancement of equatorial cooling through a Bjerknes type feedback with the thermocline adjustment. Next slide. Okay, so to conclude, the Southern Ocean warming in response to the boundary conditions of the mid-Pliocene in CSM2, as I showed in the very beginning of this talk, implied or suggested an important role for loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet on the climate. And we find that single forcing experiments in which we remove the ice sheet entirely reveals a potential for slow Southern Ocean and, by extension, subtropical Pacific warming as ocean heat transport evolves. And we also found that vegetation and Greenland ice sheet changes, which we call these Northern Hemisphere changes, cannot really explain the mid-Pliocene Pacific Ocean SST patterns. Rather, the opposite is found. And that SST pattern is probably driven largely by atmospheric processes rather than an ocean dynamical adjustment. And I think that provides evidence that the West Antarctic ice sheet is probably a key driver of the SST pattern of the mid-Pliocene. Okay, thank you.
Questions? Some questions from online? Natalie, go ahead.
Sorry, I was being patient to make sure, see if someone else wanted to ask a question. Michelle, it's so nice to see this follow-up. I think these were a lot of questions that came up in the first paper, so it's really cool to see the decomposition. One question I had, can you recover the full boundary condition warming signal when you put the two together, or have you kind of looked at that?
No, yeah, it doesn't quite come close to that 2-point 9 degrees of global warming. And I'm not sure if that's an equilibration problem, but Rand and I have talked a little bit about possible state dependence with more sensitivity to the ice sheet at higher CO2 levels potentially. But there was also, we didn't see evidence of nonlinearity in the fully coupled model, so it could be an equilibration thing, I might imagine.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, that's really. And so, if I understood correctly, you still do get some Southern Ocean warming, right, in your Greenland vegetation experiments. It's just a smaller fraction of the total warming, and it's not happening in the South Pacific sector, right? It's not happening in the.
Yeah, it's not happening in the South Pacific, but there does seem to be a little bit of warming elsewhere.
Yeah,
and,
great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more,
Very interesting.
any more questions?
You, Natalie.
Yeah, and I want to ask a question. For your slab ocean simulation, I assume the Q flux you use maybe is for the pre-industrial condition. If you derive your Q flux using your Pliocene fully coupled model, in that sense is you can compare these two slab ocean simulation. One is the Q flux derived from PI control, the other is under Pliocene simulation. You can see whether the coupling contributed something to the change of the surface temperature. Maybe not only the ocean dynamics, also the RC coupling.
Sorry, I think it wasn't. I didn't quite understand the last part of what you were saying. Sorry, do you mind repeating?
For slab ocean model, you have to use a Q flux to maintain the surface climate.
Yes.
And that Q flux is derived from, say, PI control simulation.
Yes.
Or you need to use it from your Pliocene control simulation. Those two Q flux will be different.
Yes.
And if you can run a simulation using your Pliocene control Q flux and compare that with the Q flux derived from the pre-industrial control, you can look whether the atmospheric ocean coupling have any influence to the surface climate, not only just the ocean dynamics. I think there's for the surface temperature change, you can change the ocean and circulation, you can change the atmospheric response, and you can also change the RC coupling.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a good point. It's not negligible, is it? If you have the Q flux of the Pliocene in the Pliocene simulation, it's not identical to the fully coupled Pliocene simulation. It's warmer. So is that what you were getting at? That the RC fluxes are.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
In the interest of time, I think we should move on. Thank you, Michelle, for the great talk.
Thank you.
Our next talk is Jeremy Rubenstein. Jeremy, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah. Let me see if this works.
I think we can't hear.
Oh, can you hear me all right now, or?
Yes, now.
Okay, cool. I think my microphone is over here, but the camera's here, and you guys are over here. So I'll try and do everything properly. Okay, and you guys can see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, thank you, Zhang, for organizing this, and thank you to Zhang and also NCAR for making this so easy to participate virtually. What I'm talking about today is actually really the work of a master's student here at CSU, Rachel Bernstein. I've put her picture in the upper right corner, but she can't present because she's visiting PhD programs now. And what we've done is looked at clumped isotope data from New Mexico during the Neogene to understand changes in hydroclimate and temperature during that time. And at the end, I'll compare this with some model simulations. Before I begin, I just want to thank a few people because it's been a pretty collaborative effort First, Dan Koenig, who's the second author, has been mapping this area for 3 decades, and we really could not have done this work without his pretty spectacular chronologies of the whole Rio Grande Rift Santa Fe group. All of the clumped isotope samples were run at Boulder in collaboration with Katie Snell and Ashley Maloney. And then finally, Olivia and Paul have provided some model simulations to put our results in context. So just to sort of motivate this talk, of course, there's a major question about how the southwestern US is going to respond to warming. Is it going to get wetter and drier, wetter or drier, or both? This is made complicated by the fact that there are these sort of 2 dominant moisture sources. In the summer, there's a lot of moisture that's delivered by the North American monsoon, and it's been very difficult for models to accurately simulate this monsoonal system. And in the winter, this area gets a lot of moisture from the wintertime westerlies, which are modulated by Pacific sea surface temperatures. So a major question then is, how do the monsoon and the westerlies respond to warming and therefore modify hydroclimate in the Southwest? So we've spent the past half decade or so looking at some sediments in these 2 basins outside Albuquerque and outside Espanola that contain a really spectacular record of neogene climate. So these are sediments preserved in the Rio Grande Rift, which opened about 25 million years ago and has been rifting since then. So you have a really thick sedimentary record that in some cases provides really high resolution paleoclimate records across both the middle Miocene, so a warmer period, but also throughout the entire Neogene. So I'm going to start by showing you the carbonate stable isotope data. So these are all largely Paleosol carbonates, nodules, root casts. There's also a lot of groundwater cements mixed in here. I'm going to plot the data on a graph like this, where we have the delta 18O of the carbonates on the x-axis and most of the Neogene timescale on the y-axis. Here's the middle Miocene climate optimum. Just for comparison's sake, I'm gonna show you the predicted carbonate value if these carbonates formed from wintertime precipitation, that's in this blue dash line, or if they formed from summertime precipitation. We also have several precipitation monitoring stations where we can measure the isotopic composition of precipitation in these areas. Our interpretive framework is going to be that if carbonates plot towards the left on this graph, it means a higher proportion of wintertime moisture. If they plot to the right, a greater proportion of summertime moisture. We can look at some Holocene carbonates. This is a data set published by Adam Hudson a few years ago, looking largely at the soils in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. Data from central New Mexico plot a little bit higher. Again, these plot kind of around the summertime precipitation estimate with a fair amount of variability that actually has largely to do with the spatial variability in this data set. So let me plot the geological data. The blue is data from the Espanola Basin. The red is data from the Albuquerque Basin, just a little bit to the south. And as you can see, the data largely during the Miocene overlaps very nicely with this estimated precipitation or estimated carbonate delta 18O if these carbonates form from wintertime precipitation. So we've published this work suggesting that during the middle Miocene, and particularly during the Miocene climate optimum, New Mexico had a sort of winter wet climate as indicated by these low delta 18O values. You'll notice that there's this shift towards higher values around 6 million years ago. You see this both in the Albuquerque data and potentially in the Espanola data. We don't have data, unfortunately, younger than about 6 million years in Espanola. So it's hard to know if that shift is true in Espanola. But by and large, these data shift towards the modern summertime values around 6 million years ago. And this corresponds very broadly with this idea that the North American monsoon might have turned on in the late Miocene as the Gulf of California opened and flooded as Baja ripped it away from the Sierra Madre. So what I'm going to show you next is our attempt to try and verify this hypothesis. So we selected 20 samples for clumped isotope analysis. Those are these samples here, to see if we could see this signal of a shift towards summertime precipitation in clumped isotope data. So maybe it's worth talking about what we expect from the clumped isotope data. What I'm plotting here again is age now on the x-axis, of the Neogene timescale. I've plotted temperature on this left-hand y-axis and the benthic delta 18O record on this right-hand y-axis. So the benthic stack is in this black curve, and these are 2 sites off the California margin showing cooling of SSTs since the middle Miocene. The benthic stack, of course, also has been used to show cooling and ice volume growth during the Neogene. So I'm going to put forward essentially 2 hypotheses. If really there's this shift towards more summertime moisture in the latest Miocene due to the onset of the North American monsoon, we might expect these carbonates to shift their seasonality from largely winter to summer formation, or at least spring, fall to summer formation. And so you might expect something shown in this blue dashed line here, where carbonates largely are now forming in the summer, which is hot in Albuquerque and Espanola, reflecting that monsoonal control. Alternatively, maybe that's not happening, and so actually temperatures in New Mexico are or at least carbonate formation temperatures are paced entirely by global temperatures, and so they're just going to follow the benthic stack. So what do we see? Well, let me plot the benthic stack here in the background, and I'll plot our new clumped isotope data on top of this. So this is our new clumped isotope data. The Y error bars are 2 sigma of the standard error on this measurement. It's still a fairly imprecise measurement. But the total cooling that we observe in New Mexico is 18.5 degrees. If you account for the total uncertainty, this 2 sigma, it's plus or minus 10 degrees. So anywhere from potentially an 8-degree temperature change to a almost 30-degree temperature change observed in these clumped isotope data. What's interesting, of course, about this data is it really pretty closely follows the benthic stack. There's not a lot of huge high resolution data here, but it's largely seems to be tracking many of the steps in this data. So if we go back to our hypothesis, we really see nothing like this shift towards summertime precipitation driven by the onset of some monsoonal system. Instead, there's this really nice correlation with the benthic stack. Of course, this also plots reasonably well with these SST data from off the coast of California that show, again, cooling since about 13 million years ago as well. So this is the large temperature change. I mean, 18 degrees plus or minus 10 degrees. What do we expect from climate model experiments? And here I've turned to 2 types of experiments. One is long-run MIP, which is run by Maria Rubenstein, and I've been working with Olivia, one of her master students, on extracting data from this MIP. The other is MyoMIP, and working with Paul Acosta on this. So what I'm plotting here is CO2 on this axis, and the change in mean annual temperature on this axis relative to kind of pre-industrial values. So these are the change in mean annual temperature over Espanola, New Mexico in the 5 models that we're considering. So of course it gets warmer as CO2 goes up. This is true both in MyoMIP and in long-run MIP. Where does our data plot on this chart? Our data plot kind of in this box, right? We don't know the exact CO2 for the middle Miocene. This is still a fairly somewhat controversial topic. If I had to guess, it's up in the upper hundreds, if not 1,000 parts per million. So somewhere up in here, but there are other reconstructions that suggest lower PCO2. The y-axis on this box is, of course, set by our clumped isotope data. And what's interesting is, despite huge amounts of error in CO2 reconstructions and in our clumped isotope data, all of this data lie well above what climate models would predict should be the warming in New Mexico. So, the magnitude of middle Miocene warmth is seemingly not replicated in these models. So the question is why? One possibility, of course, is the models might be under-predicting the temperature response to warming. Perhaps this is due to vegetation feedbacks and say, overly sensitive vegetation that produces more latent heat, and more of that should go to sensible heat. I think one would need to do more experiments to know if that's the case. There are lots of reasons also why the data might not be interpretable as like a mean annual temperature change. So one problem, of course, is we're assuming that our youngest sample is representative of 280 parts per million. It's a late Pliocene sample. We don't have age constraints good enough to know if that sits in a Pliocene glacial or a Pliocene. Oh, sorry, it's actually an early Quaternary sample. If that sits in an early Quaternary glacial or an early Quaternary interglacial. So we don't really know what the CO2 is in that for that sample. There's also suggestions that this area may have uplifted during the Neogene by 1, maybe 2 kilometers due to dynamic topography effects associated with the Farallon slab. So it's possible if this area is uplifted, there's an uplift signal in this signal as well. And I'll suggest that maybe there's a change in seasonality that's sort of masked in the signal relative to the 18O. And there's been some recent work by Katie Snell and her former PhD student, Rachel Havernack, suggesting that clumped isotopes and 18O isotopes may be decoupled seasonally when soil carbonates form. And that may also cause us to overestimate the temperature response. The last thing we can do is look at the reconstructed precipitation delta HNO. So this is, we have a carbonate delta HNO, we have our temperature, so we know the fractionation, and we can look at then at soil water delta HNO and try and assume that that reflects precipitation delta HNO. Again, I've plotted the winter mean precipitation delta HNO in the dashed blue line, and I plotted the summer precipitation in this dotted red line. What's interesting here, unlike our just raw carbonate data, is there is seemingly no long-term trend in the reconstructed precipitation delta HNO. That is to say, we don't see some major increase at 6 million years ago, signaling some onset of the monsoon related to opening the Gulf of California. Of course, these error bars are large. That has to do with the large error bars in the clumped isotope data. But there's no, I look at this and I see no screaming signal of a change, long-term change in the precipitation delta HNO that's being recorded by carbonates in this region. So I'll just leave some conclusions and end a little bit early. Seemingly carbonate formation temperatures seem to be tracking global temperatures, which is for geologists, I think, a major surprise. We tend to think that carbonates are really seasonally biased. And if that's the case, then there's some seasonality effect in here that's largely causing it to track the trends in global temperature. If this is a change in mean annual temperature, this is, you cannot simulate this by just simply raising CO2 and climate models. There has to be something else going on. I would suspect this has to do with an uplift signal, a broad wavelength uplift in northern New Mexico related to late Neogene uplift of the front. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to take any questions. And I've also put Rachel's email down here at the bottom in case you'd like to contact her with questions or to ask more questions about the clumped isotopes or the data.
Questions for Jeremy? Fun?
Nice talk, Jeremy. So have you compared the long-run simulations with benthic foreign records because they are supposed to be more stable environmental compared to the surface record?
Yeah, you mean, that's a good question. You mean take the long-run MIP data and look at the deep ocean, predicted deep ocean temperature change.
Yes.
So I haven't done that. It would be a good idea. Maybe that's been done, but I don't believe it has. I don't know if Olivia is around either on this call or in person to answer that question, but it's a good idea.
Thank you.
Thanks. Don?
Yeah, Jeremy, the last figure that you showed was really, really intriguing because isotope has always been known to have like large errors. I mean, when you compare with the benthic record.
Oh, this one, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, obviously people think the benthic record is representing the global temperature, but your location is actually very close to the tropics. So I was wondering, have you looked at the models to see how that, I mean, obviously you can, but just based on the proxy, you wouldn't know that tropical temperature evolution. But when you look at the models, have you tried to see, like, does the model's tropical temperature also represent their global temperature evolution? And
that's a good question. To the best of my knowledge, there's some work that's been done on that with regards to long-run MIP. I'd have to ask Maria or Olivia what else they've done and ask what we could do. We've mostly been using long run MIP just because it largely has an equilibrated ocean atmosphere. So trying to see what the temperature is, but of course, it doesn't get the California sea surface temperature, the marginal temperatures at all correct, right, relative to data. So there are other issues, but I'd have to ask if they've done that other analysis. That's a good idea.
Cool. Yeah, this is a really nice record. Yeah, it's the first time I think it actually matches the global.
I agree. I think Rachel and I and Katie were all very shocked that it looks like this.
This is
So,
very cool.
still casting around for some ideas of what even could cause this.
And Natalie, go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy. Nice talk. I would just make the point, reiterating the point you just made, that the sea surface temperature records are not actually being fully captured by at least the Miocene models, the models that are targeting the Miocene. And so what could be interesting, and Paul Acosta's done this for a study for Europe, is if you prescribe the sea surface temperatures in a simulation, can you then do a better job of recovering the records on land? It doesn't get to the question of why the sea surface temperatures were warmer and why the models aren't getting that signal, but it's not a unique problem to the terrestrial realm, right? We see it in the North Atlantic and the Pacific. So yeah.
Right. No, that would be a fascinating thing to look at, and I guess it's a little hard for me to think that even doing that you might be able to get up here really high, but if you get even within this box, that would be helpful because we have large uncertainties on this data. So, it'd be interesting to know. I guess I was a little, to me, I look at this record and I think, well, there has to be some uplift signal in here, which has otherwise been very hard to back out from other types of paleoaltimetry work just because the signal of temperature change is so large. So, but I'd be very curious to do that kind of analysis as well with Paul.
Paul, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that Fang, Jung, and I try to write a proposal to do something like this, but it'd be great to do a study with your records, so that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I hope the proposal gets funded.
It was for an NCAR like spring meeting or something. I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Jeremy, I would like to hear your thoughts on the relatively flat Delta 18O in precipitation. I think you have done high CO2 modeling, and you may agree that for warmer climate, the Delta 18O might be higher. So what do you think about this apparent discrepancy?
It's a great question. And I almost didn't put this slide in because I don't have a great explanation for why this Delta 18O is so constant. I would just point out the errors here are large. So, I think it's hard to know if these errors are masking actually fairly large changes in Delta 18O through time. I would say one thing that might occur if models are underestimating warming because of vegetation feedback, say there's too much partitioning of energy to latent heat versus sensible heat, that should show up in Delta 18O as a change in how much recycling of moisture you have. So I think these problems might be related. Precisely the degree of coupling or even the direction, I think it needs more work. But if that's the case, then there might be some way of explaining some of this data as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. And in the interest of time, I think we need to move on to the next speaker from Chunyu Yang. Thank you, Jeremy.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah. So is it work already?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Hi everyone.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Chunyu and I'm from the University of Connecticut. And today I'd like to introduce our ongoing work on effective radiofusing and share some preliminary results. This study is motivated by a fundamental assumption whether radiofusing scales linearly with log CO2 and is independent of the climatological base state. To address this question, we need to first clarify the different definitions of radiofusing we commonly use. Firstly, we have instantaneous radiofusing or IRF. This is the immediate change in night radiation at the top of the atmosphere right after a perturbation. And second, we have stratosphere adjusted radiofusing or SARF, and this allows the stratosphere to adjust its temperature to radiative equilibrium. Finally, there's effective radiofusing, ERF, which is the most complete metric. It includes all rapid atmospheric adjustments that happen without any change in surface temperature. So it is better than IRF or RF because it separates forcing from feedbacks more cleanly. With this definition in place, we can now turn to two key previous studies that motivate the information and inform our analysis. Look first at the figure on the left. We can see that radiofusing shows a log relationship with CO2 concentration, and the figure on the right, meanwhile, demonstrate that IRF depends on the background climate state. We can see from the panel B and C show how the climate state evolves over time, and the three time points highlighted in panel A correspond to these different states, directly illustrating this dependency. Building on these findings, our work shifts the focus from RF and IRF to effective radiofusing. Specifically, we address two key questions. The first one is, does ERF scale linearly with log CO2? And the second one is ERF independent of the climate background? Let's now look at how we estimate ERF. There are two main approaches for estimating ERF: fixed SST and regression. The fixed SST method keeps sea surface temperature constant to isolate external forcing using atmosphere-only models. And the regression method uses fully coupled models in transient simulations, regressing net TOA flux against global mean surface temperature changes. Obviously, the fixed SST method is simpler, and you can see at the figure shows here, both approaches give very similar results, and here we use fixed SST method. And for experiment design, in our study, we use ICSM version 1.3 as the base model with NE30 resolution. And our experimental design focused on two baseline states, the pre-industrial state and the Eocene state. And for each baseline, we run simulations with varying CO2 levels from 1 times, 3 times, 6 times, and 9 times to the current concentration. Each simulation is run for 30 years, and we analyze the final 20 years of output. Specifically, we designed 3 sets of experiments, each run at 1 times, 3 times, 6 times, and 9 times CO2, which gives us a total of 12 simulations. The first set use pre-industrial boundary conditions and pre-industrial SSTs for all 4 CO2 levels. And for the second set, we switch to Eocene boundary conditions, but we keep the SSTs at pre-industrial values. Here, to reduce mismatches between land fraction and SST, we replace the land temperature at each latitude with the ocean zonal mean temperature. And we again run all 4 CO2 levels. And finally, for the third set, we update the SSDs to using values, while keeping everything else the same as in the second set. After getting our and after getting our experiments results, we calculate effective radial forcing and break it down into different adjustment components. And first, ERF is calculated as the change in net radiation at the top of the atmosphere, which we call ISCOM, which equals the net shortwave radiation at the top of the atmosphere, minus the outgoing long-wave radiation at the top of the atmosphere. And then the URF is simply the difference between the perturbed experiment, which we call N times CO2, and the control experiment, which we call 1 times CO2. And next, we decompose URF into individual adjustment terms using the radiative kernel method, following Pendergrass 2018. In this approach, each adjustment is calculated as a product of K sub x, and the radiative kernel for variable x, and the change in the climate variable, which is x perturber minus x control. And the kernel basically tells us how sensitive the top of atmosphere radiation is to a unit change in a particular variable, like temperature or water vapor measured in watts per meter square per unit change. And here, it needs to know that this method does not include stratospheric adjustment. And the last one is cloud adjustments. Cloud adjustments are a bit tricky because cloud interact with radiation is in a non-linear way. So the standard kernel method isn't enough. To handle this, we use the decomposition method from 2008, which isolates the pure cloud radiative effect by separating it from temperature, water vapor, and albedo effects. In this way, we capture only the cloud contribution without interference from other variables, giving us a complete breakdown of all rapid adjustment mechanisms that contribute to ERF. Now let's examine our key results. These figures shows the relationship between ERF and log CO2 across 3 different climate configurations, allowing us to directly address our initial questions. First, we confirm that ERF maintains a linear relationship with log CO2. All 3 lines are remarkably straight, validating the log scaling assumption that has been widely used. However, this is critical, that ERF is clearly dependent on the background climate state. We can see this through the different slopes of the 3 lines. The blue cycles representing pre-industrial SSD with pre-industrial boundary conditions shows the weakest ERF response. And the orange squares represent pre-industrial SSD, but using boundary conditions exhibits a stronger response. And most strikingly, the green one, the combining using SSD with using boundary conditions, produce the largest ERF amplification. And to quantify exactly how the background climate state affects radiative forcing, we now subtract the PI baseline from our other experiments. Just look like the gray headline show here. This isolates the pure effect of changing the climate background. Specifically, we calculate like the orange one, which means we use the combining using SST with using boundary conditions minus pre-industrial SST with pre-industrial boundary conditions, representing the full using background effect. And the blue line we use pre-industrial SST, but using boundary conditions minus pre-industrial SST with pre-industrial boundary conditions, which represents boundary condition effect only. And all of this across CO2 levels of 3 times, 6 times, and 9 times. Looking at these 3 panels together, we can see how the background climate state may influence the results. The ERF difference appears to grow strongly with log CO2. For example, the orange line reaches nearly 1.8 at log 9, while the blue line reaches only 0.4. We think this suggests that the warmer using climate background may substantially amplify ERF. With this amplification possibly becoming more pronounced at higher CO2 levels. The RF differences here also increase with CO2, but their magnitudes are much smaller than those of ERF. We think this indicates that RF alone may not fully explain the background dependency observed in ERF. And we think the key to understanding this discrepancy may lie in the right panel, the fast adjustments. The fast adjustments show positive growth with log CO2, particularly for the orange line, while the blue line remains near 0 or slightly positive. And the fact that adjustment differences are positive and increasing suggests that they could amplify the background state effect beyond what RF alone would predict. And finally, let's examine which specific adjustments process may be responsible for the ERF amplification we've observed. And this figure breaks down cloud adjustments into their long wave, short wave, and total components. Looking at the left panel, the orange line shows strong positive growth, indicating that long wave cloud warming may be dramatically enhanced in the using climate background and increases with CO2. In the middle panel, the orange line hovers near 0, while the blue line shows negative values, suggesting that may suggest that the short wave cloud cooling that exists in colder climates may be a larger surprise in the warmer using background. And when we look at the total cloud adjustment in the right panel, it's dominated by the long wave component, with the orange line reaching to 0.85 at log 9. We assume that this physical mechanism may work through a chain like a warmer SST patterns may alter atmospheric stability, convection, humidity, and winds, which in turn may modify cloud taps and cloud top heights. We think this suggests that cloud adjustment may be the dominant driver of ERF amplification under warmer background climate states. In summary, our study demonstrates that ERF maintains a linear relationship with log CO2, but is dependent on the background climate state, with warmer Eocene-like climates substantially amplifying ERF. For the next steps, we plan to calculate the instantaneous already forcing to complete our forcing decomposition. And based on our current results, we found that the changes in surface temperature, troposphere temperature, and water vapor adjustments are surprisingly small, while the surface albedo adjustment becomes increasingly negative with higher CO2 levels. And we think all of these patterns requires further analysis to understand their underlying physical causes and spatial distributions. That's it. Thanks.
Great talk. Questions? Maybe I can start with questions. I have quite a few questions, actually. I want to start with your ERF estimation for pre-industrial. If I remember correctly, you got a number of 6? Or did I miss anything? The ERF for pre-industrial climate state.
ERF in pre. Yes, true.
Yeah, what's your number? It's in one of your plot.
Sorry, I don't. Uh,
Okay, maybe my suggestion would be check your result against the canonical pre-industrial value, which should be 4 watts per meter square, right? Ran, do you remember?
For 3 times CO2, she got
Oh, for pre-industrial, it should be
For-
4 watts per meter square, right? The ERF.
no, she's doing the 3 times CO2, John. 3 times 6 times and
Okay.
9 times CO2. It's not
Okay,
for doubling
that makes
CO2.
sense. Okay.
Yeah, Tony, you can go back to the figure. I think John was asking about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think I missed that. Okay. Any more questions? Since we have time, maybe I can add a couple comments. I think you may want to check out Matt Huber's paper in 2013. He quantified the instantaneous radiative forcing and also the adjustments as well. Yeah, I think it's worth checking to compare. And I also quantified that in my paper. And another comment about the separation of cloud shortwave and long wave, I think it's very surprising to me. In all my analysis, I tend to say shortwave cloud feedback response is the dominant term. You are showing the long wave is more important. I think maybe one thing you can quickly check is to use APRP to quantify the shortwave components, so you can do a quick comparison to see whether the kernel method give you consistent results. Thank you so much. Really interesting results. Maybe we can, if there's no more questions, we can move on to the next talk. The next talk is from Go Seto. Go, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah, the talk is the response of ENSO diversity and asymmetry to mid-Holocene climate. Please go ahead.
Let me share my screen.
Yes, please.
Okay. Right. My name is Go. I'm a PhD student at Georgia Mason University. Today I'm very excited to share our research. The title is The Response of ENSO Diversity and Asymmetry to the Mid-Holocene Climate. We use both proxy records and isotope-enabled Earth model simulations. I'd like to start with the ENSO diversity. We have linear 3.4 time series here. And besides its strong inter-annual variability, we can see the ENSO asymmetry, which means typically strong El Niño events tend to be stronger than La Niña events in terms of the magnitudes. And this asymmetry actually can be different depending on the regions you're looking at. For example, I have the I'm sorry. I have the figure from 1997 strong El Niño here, and it's centered in the Eastern Pacific, but the following La Niña actually centered over the Central Pacific. And it can be seen in the bottom figure, which explains multiple ENSO events in terms of the longitudinal SSC distributions. For example, this brown curve explains this, strong El Nino from 1997. It has strong SST anomalies over the Eastern Pacific, while not so much over the rest of the basin. While La Nina events have strong SST anomalies over the Central Pacific. So this highlights the importance of ENSO diversity, which means both spatial pattern and amplitude of ENSO can be really different depending on the event. And then let's dive into the mid-Holocene climate, which is 6,000 years ago. A lot of studies focused on ENSO variability during this period due to the increased insolation during the boreal summer. For example, the left one is the study over the Eastern Pacific used mollusk shells. They were able to capture reduced ENSO variability in panel A, and actually not many studies are focusing on ENSO asymmetry, but they also capture calculated skewness of the mollusk shells, and then they were able to capture reduced ENSO asymmetry as well. The right one is the study also focusing on ENSO variability. This is over the Central Pacific. Panel AC shows different islands, and then they also capture reduced ENSO variability. Box is the simulation, and then dots are the proxy records. They also highlight the important problem that generally climate models underestimate the ENSO variability reduction. And what are the mechanisms behind these ENSO changes during the mid-Holocene? So there are possible mechanisms. First one is orbital forcing due to increased insolation during mid-Holocene, which excited anomalous westerly winds in the over the Western Pacific, and it generated downwind Kelvin wave to the east, and it deepened the thermocline over the east and Central Pacific, which resulted in weaker vertical feedbacks. Finally, it resulted in reduced ENSO variability over the Eastern Pacific. At the same time, there's another hypothesis, Green Sahara forcing. I know after my talk, there's a lecture about Green Sahara over the Holocene, so I hope I can provide some insights into it. So basically, increased insolation during summer resulted in intensified monsoon systems over the northern hemisphere. And then Sahara actually was experiencing intensified West African monsoon, which resulted in Atlantic Nino condition over the tropical Atlantic, which changed the shifted and intensified local circulation over the Pacific. This deepened the thermocline over the Pacific, and also during winter, it generated La Nina-like condition over the Pacific. So this hypothesis can also explain reduced ENSO variability. And finally, I'd like to mention there's another mechanism. Warm water subduction from the southern subtropical Pacific actually also helped deepening the thermocline. Okay, so I'd like to point out some gaps in the previous studies. The first one is that different amplitude and spatial pattern of ENSO types, especially La Nina types during this mid-Holocene remain unclear. And the relationships between different types of ENSO and the ENSO variability and asymmetry during this period are also not well understood. Finally, like I said, climate models sometimes underestimate the reduction of ENSO variability. Therefore, in this study, we'd like to focus on how the amplitude and the spatial pattern of different ENSO types looked like and how they were different from the pre-industrial climate. And we investigate the mechanisms behind these ENSO diversity changes and their impacts on the overall variability and asymmetry. We also incorporate Green Sahara forcing. Finally, in order to accomplish these two objectives, we need a more direct proxy model comparison so that we use isotope-enabled climate model. So yeah, like I said, we use isotope-enabled CSN 1.2, and we have PI control simulation, and actually we have two different 6K simulations. The first one is orbital simulation, which follows the PIMIFO protocol. And then another one is orbital plus Green Sahara, which also incorporates Green Sahara forcing. And we use the last 200 years of outputs because we consider these 200 years to be the equilibrium state after models adjusting the boundary conditions. And in order to compare model simulations with observations, we use proxy, high resolution monthly mollusk and coral oxygen isotope records from the Eastern Pacific, Central Pacific, and the Western Pacific. I'm sorry. All right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the, how to capture multiple enzymes. So previous studies were largely depending on E and C indices, which are based on SST, EOF1, EOF2. But actually, these indices cannot really capture La Nina events. They are mostly focusing on El Nino types. And another point is that these EOF1 and EOF2 are calculated separately in each observation or model. That means these EOF patterns themselves can be really different depending on the observations, models, or even different climate intervals. Therefore, we decided to project monthly SST anomalies from 6K onto the EOS from PI control. In this way, we ensure a direct comparison between 6K and PI control by obtaining two PCs for 6K under the same latent space of PI control. After selecting El Nino and La Nina months, we apply Gaussian mixture model clustering. It captures multiple ENS types in the PC1, PC2 latent space by detecting Gaussian distributions of ENS events. And in this way, we can capture not only El Nino types, but also different La Nina types as well. All right, so let's look at the ENS variability and asymmetry by data model comparison. So the figure on the left, we have variability in the first column calculated by standard deviation, and then asymmetry in the second column calculated by skewness. The panel A, B are the result from proxy delta weighting, and then the middle is the simulated delta weighting, and then finally we have simulated SST anomalies. And first, if we look at the variability, we can see, I'm sorry, I forgot to explain that blacks are PI control or pre-industrial result, and the red each colors a mid-Holocene result, and the same for simulations, but simulation also has green ones, green stars or triangles. They are orbital plus green Sahara simulation. And then if you look at variability, the first column, regardless of proxy or simulations, all the regions show reduced standard deviation during mid-Holocene. That means ENSO's variability was reduced during mid-Holocene. And then for asymmetry, again, regardless of proxy or simulations, both East and Central Pacific show reduced skewness, while Western Pacific shows increased skewness. That means overall, ENSO symmetry was also reduced during the mid-Holocene. And then if you compare orbital and orbital plus green Sahara simulations, for example, I have a table here, the reduction percentage of variability. The reduction percentage indicated by orbital plus green Sahara is much close to the proxy reductions compared to orbital only simulation. We don't have table for asymmetry, but we find the same result for asymmetry. So I'd like to point out that beta model proxy consistency was found in the 6K orbital plus green Sahara simulation. Okay, so like I said, orbital plus green Sahara can capture more similar reduction percentage of variability and asymmetry to the proxy records. We are focusing on orbital plus green Sahara for the 6K condition. And then here I have figures. We are able to capture 4 different ENSO types based on the GMM clustering. And panels A, B have strong positive SST anomalies extending across East and Central Pacific. We name this extreme El Nino. And then panels C, D have moderate positive SST anomalies over Central Pacific. We name this Central Pacific or CP El Nino. And then panels EF has Central Pacific La Nina. There are moderate negative SST anomalies over Central Pacific. And then finally, the last 2 panels, we have strong negative SST anomalies over Central and the Western Pacific. We name this baseline La Nina. And what were the major changes during the mid-Holocene? So for extreme El Nino, we have absence of strong SST anomalies off the South American coast, and also weaker latitudinal extent. And for CP type El Nino and La Nina, this value weakened during mid-Holocene. And lastly, for basin-wide La Nina, again, it weakened especially over the Western Pacific. Because this GMM clustering method can capture every answer event in each month, so that we have this colorful time series based on 4 different answer types in each month. And panels BE show the number of answer events from the time series, and then panel CF shows occurrences and variances of 4 answer types respectively. Firstly, if you look at the dark red ones, which is extreme El Nino, from time series, we can see its frequency was reduced during 6Ka. And it can be also seen in the occurrences, a reduced occurrence of extreme El Nino during 6Ka. And actually, not only that, the distribution of this extreme El Nino is also shifted to less positive side during 6Ka. That means both frequency and amplitude of extreme El Nino were reduced during 6Ka. For CP El Nino, La Nina, orange and blue one, light blue ones, frequency didn't change a lot from time series, and then we can see the same thing from the occurrences, but their distribution actually shifted to less positive side or less negative side during 6Ka. Overall, slightly weaker CP and La Nina events. And then finally, if you look at dark blue ones, which is basin-wide La Nina events, again, frequency didn't change a lot from time series and from occurrences, but definitely the distribution shifted to less negative side. That means weaker basin-wide La Nina events. And then overall, if we calculate the variances at the Nina 3.4, reduced variance of Nina 3.4 can largely explained by both extreme El Nino and then basin-wide La Nina. Then how about their changes on answer symmetry? Again, we have the same figure, asymmetry read by proxy and simulations, and panels on the middle are the SST distributions for Nina 1+2 and Nina 3.4. Overall, less frequent and weaker extreme El Nino and weaker basin-wide La Nina can explain squash distributions on the middle, and that means reduced answer symmetry. And if we look at regional differences, Eastern Pacific show figure on the left, Eastern Pacific show more significant reduction in answer symmetry compared to Central Pacific. This is because Eastern Pacific has more influences from extreme El Nino compared to La Nina events. We can also see large reduction in positive tail side, but not so much negative tail side. But for Central Pacific, not only El Nino, but also there's large influence from basin-wide La Nina. That's why we can see a large reduction in negative tail side, which again resulted in relatively small reduction in answer symmetry. So let's understand the mechanism behind these changes, especially focusing on the mean state from June to August, because we can see the large insolation anomalies in this period, and also this period is attributed to the answer development phase. So we have a figure here. These are the anomalies between orbital minus PI control in the first column, and anomalies between orbital plus Green Sahara and PI control in the second column. The panels AB show insolation anomalies, panels DE are surface temperature and winds anomalies, and panels GH are vertical velocities, and then finally bottom mixed layer and thermocline. So first, panels DE show anomalous vessel winds over the Western Pacific for both panels DE, and also panels GH show strengthened upward motion over the Western Pacific, while strengthened downward motion over the Eastern Pacific. That means Pacific local circulation was strengthened during mid-Holocene. And panels JK explain deepened mixed layer and thermocline during mid-Holocene. If we compare the first column and second column, actually orbital plus Green Sahara generate more significant anomalies. This is consistent with previous studies. Orbital plus Green Sahara can explain more can expect additional reduction, and also from our figure, from our results. And also basic these changes in mean state are the key points that explain basic reduction in symmetry and variability. Finally, I'd like to introduce a little bit about our ongoing research about the dynamic mechanisms to understand answer diversity by looking at mixed layer heat budget during the development phase. I just picked up extreme El Nino and basement La Nina here. Actually, the developments of them are weakened. And for extreme El Nino, there are three large contributors: weaker thermocline, weaker upwelling, and weaker zonal advective feedbacks. While for basement La Nina, we found weaker thermocline and weaker zonal advective feedbacks are the main contributors to weaken the development. To conclude, both proxy and ICSM show reduced answer variability and asymmetry across the tropical Pacific during the mid-Holocene. And interestingly, orbital plus green Sahara provides closer agreement with proxy records in terms of the magnitude of reduction in variability and asymmetry. This highlights the significant role of vegetation, land feedback, and genome clustering analysis revealed changes in the diversity, including La Nina events, and especially less frequent and weaker extreme El Nino, as well as weaker baseline La Nina events contributed to weaker reduced answer variability and asymmetry. Finally, our ongoing work about heat budget analysis suggests that less frequent and weaker extreme El Nino can be actually explained by mainly weaker vertical advections, while weaker baseline La Nina can be explained by both zonal and vertical advections. All right, I'll stop here. I'm happy to take questions, and feel free to email me for further discussions or comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the great talk. We have a seminar to catch at 11, so maybe we can ask one question. Sylvia?
Hi, thank you so much for that really interesting talk. I was just wondering about two things. One, did you think about how the SST pattern biases, CESM, compared to observed CP and EP events might affect these results? And then the second thing is, did you look at all at sensitivity to the definition of CP and EP events and which index you use?
Okay, yeah. So about the first question regarding the biases of SST patterns from the model.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Or just
yeah.
how different they are from observed CP and EP events.
Oh yeah, but yeah, okay, generally about CP and EP events. Yeah. So oops, yeah. So actually we didn't follow any previous studies. We for the first time named these events that are just looking at the spatial patterns of SST anomalies. Because this GMM clustering is quite a new method for paleoclimate research to understand answer diversity. But I believe these are consistent with previous studies, even though the definition is not the same. Especially for baseline La Nina, I think this is a new finding that not many studies captured this baseline La Nina previously. Yeah, but I think yeah, but I think these are I think new, but I think quantitatively we are trying to understand this these are the real contributors to overall variability and asymmetry like here. So I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Go. I think we need to stop here.
I guess we'll get started. Please mute yourself. Good afternoon, everybody. We will start afternoon session of CSM Paleoclimate Winter Working Group meeting. Our first talk is going to be given by Bronwyn Konke on insights from CCSM 3 and CSM 1.2 on contrasting interpretations of IDCZ in tropical South America since the LGM. So please take away from.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's really good to see you. I did just share my screen and it worked. So let's see if I can repeat the process. Hit that button. Okay. Do you again see the correct thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, I wish I was there with those of you who are in Boulder, but it's nice to see your faces, even though they are small. I'm Bronwyn Konecki. I'm an associate professor in Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at WashU. And I'm going to present today something that was really inspired by some work that my PhD student did. And I'm going to explain sort of why we went from something we were working on in the lab to now going down this sort of rabbit hole of analyzing some of these model simulations. So I'll walk you through all of that. So just to put the sort of canonical picture of the tropical rain belt on the screen here, this is like what you get if you look at Wikipedia. We're all very familiar with this. The idea at least in the Quaternary and for most of paleoclimate history, there's been this prevalent idea in the literature that the ITCZ and the ITCZ plus land-based rainfall, so really the whole tropical rain belt, if it shifts south, it should make a lot of the southern hemisphere tropics wetter and the northern hemisphere tropics drier. And so for those of us who are thinking a lot about South America, how this translates is that a southward shift to the ITCZ should make tropical South America wetter and northern South America drier. So just to put that up there, because that's sort of the framework that I came into when I was starting to work on this project. So what I'm showing you is some work that my former PhD student, Sandro Marcheri, did for his dissertation. He's now at University of Chicago. And I'm showing you some records coming from Lago de Tota, which is this lake right over here in the yellow star. Can you see my cursor? Maybe? No? No? Okay. You'll have to just find the yellow star yourself then. Okay. And so in my lab, we are organic geochemists, we're stable isotope geochemists. And so we worked with these lake sediments and these new cores that are very unique from this part of South America and that they are long and continuous. So they're 19,000 years long. We have continuous sedimentation all the way to the late Holocene, which is a really amazing opportunity for northern South America. And so what you're seeing on the top in the red and in the blue in the middle is two different stable isotope measurements that were made on long chain alkanes coming from plant waxes that were washed or blown into the sediments of Lake Tota over time. And this is what we use to reconstruct changes in hydroclimate. So what you're seeing in the blue in particular is what I really want you to focus on. I've oriented the axis here so that more enriched delta D of precipitation is up and more depleted delta D of precipitation is down. And over the course of the last 19,000 years, there are some pretty large fluctuations in the delta D of precipitation. And over the course of the Holocene, there's this really interesting trend towards more depleted values going to the present. On the bottom of the figure here is the Cariaco Basin. This is, again, a canonical record that a lot of us are familiar with. This is a record of titanium for the Holocene and then reflectance for the older periods that are interpreted in basically the same way. And the Cariaco Basin record is essentially the go-to for our proxy for ITCZ position over this time period. So when we see that squiggly line going down, it indicates a southward shift of the ITCZ, bringing less of that terrigenous material to the Cariaco Basin. So what's really interesting about this is that it's perhaps not exactly what we would have expected coming from our site. Now, we did get very excited initially that these records looked very similar between the Cariaco Basin record and our Tota hydrogen isotope record in the middle there. But if you look very carefully, the relationship is actually opposite of what one might expect. The leaf wax delta D integrates or reflects precipitation delta D, which anywhere, but especially at this site, is going to integrate the integrated history of convection and rainout over a fairly large area. So what I'm showing here with those little pink lines and arrows is the pathway of moisture that enters the South American continent from the Atlantic Ocean. And so the way that we interpret precipitation delta D at Tota is to reflect this integrated history of convection upstream, which is really in the lowlands of Venezuela and all of that area of northern South America. So incidentally, it's actually a pretty similar area to the catchment of the Orinoco River, which is supposed to be what's draining into Cariaco. So we would have expected at the outset that these two records should look similar, but in the same direction. So we would expect that if the ITCZ is shifting south and Cariaco is drying out, then we should see other sites in the region following the same behavior. And that's really not what we see here. So to add to this complexity, I'm now showing several records. These are now a whole bunch of basic only Holocene length records. There's not that many records that extend further back than this that are based on hydrogen or oxygen isotopes of precipitation going back to the early Holocene. And all of these other records, or almost all of these other records, are in the southern hemisphere Andes. So another thing that we should expect to see if a kind of classic canonical shift, southward shift of the ITCZ and the tropical rain belt over the course of the Holocene, what we would expect to see from records from the northern hemisphere Andes and the southern hemisphere Andes is anti-phasing between the two. And actually, we don't see that. We see that these records are actually all in phase, which raises yet some more confusion. And just doesn't jive with what we expected. So I spent a lot of time over the last few months digging into different climate model experiments to try to figure out, what are some ways that we could possibly explain this? I've gone through the exercise with my students of like, look at this map of northern South America and draw where the ITCZ should be at different points in time. And we just can't do it. Like, we just can't reconcile these records that way. So what I started off with was the original Trace 21K simulation. And this has been used extensively all over the world, as those of you in this room know. But in particular, it's actually been demonstrated already to do a pretty decent job at representing South American summer monsoon dynamics. And so there's a really cool paper looking at LGM to present climate in the South American summer monsoon region. And so I thought this would be a really good place to start, even though this isn't the same part of South America, still useful. And then I also, because I don't yet have the full Trace, new Trace experiment with the Holocene, I turned to these other time slice experiments that are available. Thank you, Zhang, for making these available, and have been used. They were used as the model priors for the LGM reanalysis data assimilation. And so these are really awesome resources for the community with a more up-to-date version of CESM. It's isotope enabled. And so I looked at 9 different time slices to at least get some sense of not exactly a time series, but something that sort of resembles that. So the first thing that I did was just looked at the representation of precipitation in these simulations. So what you're seeing on the left here is June, July, August, and DJF precipitation from, that's a reanalysis, not observations, but close enough. And then what you see in the middle here is Trace 21K in the middle column, and then the control run from these time slices, or one of the control runs from these time slices. So what's really interesting about this, and this is not specific to CCSM3, it's actually true of a lot of model simulations out there, is that the precipitation in northern South America is not super well represented. And that's especially true, I'm not showing it here, but especially during the shoulder seasons, that's really the case. And the dry season, it's a little tough. This is a part of the continent where the topography of the Andes really influences what's happening with this low-level jet circulation that brings in moisture from the tropical Atlantic and from the Caribbean. But there's topography and other things there, and some of these regions just aren't represented super well in models. And there's actually been papers published on this, and CESM2 does a better job than most of the other models out there. So at least there's that. So the rest of today, I'm actually not going to look at Trace anymore. I'm just going to look at these more recent time slice simulations. Okay, so what I'm showing here is a postage stamp plot of changes in annual mean precipitation relative to the pre-industrial in 8 of these time slices. So I think what you can see if you stare at this for a little while is that the two simulations that really jump out the most are these hosing experiments. So these are the 16 Ka time slice and the 12 Ka time slice. There are versions of these experiments with and without hosing in the North Atlantic to try to replicate or better simulate an approximation of what could have been happening with real climate during those times. And so we see in those experiments that include the hosing, there is a kind of classic southward shift of the ITCZ, which does dry out the interior of northern South America. And it also makes the southern end of the monsoon region wetter. The other shifts during the Holocene, during 9K, 6K, and 3K, are actually a lot more complex. And I know the color scale is sort of dictated by these hosing time slices here, but there's actually a lot of other complexities going on that don't quite follow the same pattern. So what I'm showing here is this is no longer the anomalies. This is actually just looking at the climatology, which I have found to be really, really helpful in just understanding the structure of the rain belt and what it is doing over the course of these experiments. So what you'll see, this is now just 12K, 9K, 6K, and 3K. And it's June, July, August precipitation. And you'll see that in the early Holocene, the oceanic ITCZ is kind of like pinched northward and eastward, basically like separated from precipitation that's falling over the continent. So you see that in the 12K and in the 9K experiment. And then as the Holocene progresses and the ITCZ does shift south over the ocean, it's subtle, but it is doing that. But we see not just a southward shift, but also this like expansion towards the continent, this expansion westward, which is what I'm showing right here. So what I've been thinking of this as is kind of in the late Holocene, we do have an expansion of the southern limit of the ITCZ, and this like handshake is what I've been calling it between the oceanic and continental moisture that sort of meet up right off the coast, which is really important because that is where moisture is being imported onto the continent. Here I'm showing it in anomaly space, so the same thing, but it's just to give you a sense for what this actually looks like relative to the pre-industrial. And in particular, the winds here, you're seeing that there is this strengthened South Atlantic subtropical high, particularly in the early Holocene. And that seems to actually be potentially driving some of what we're seeing with this like handshake behavior, in that we're seeing this westward shift of the low pressure in the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, kind of on either side of the ITCZ, which is directing the winds offshore, northeastern South America. And then as the ITCZ shifts south, and that the South Atlantic subtropical high weakens, that allows those winds to shift so that more and more of that moisture is being brought towards the continent and onto the continent. Most of northern South America actually gets wetter over the course of the Holocene in these simulations. If it is a legit thing to do to compare time slices to each other in this sort of time series sense, which we could debate if that's actually legit for me to do. But if that's the case, then we actually see either a very minor change or most of these locations getting wetter and not drier. When we look at the delta D of precipitation, we actually see that most of northern South American delta D of precip gets more negative over the course of the Holocene. Not more enriched and not drier as we would expect based on just a pure canonical ITCZ shift type of mechanism. So now I'm showing the same thing that I showed you before in the top two rows. The bottom row now is the change in the delta D of precipitation. And so you can see that it's really not exactly a one-to-one with precipitation amount, but there's a lot that we can actually take away from this. The precipitation in northern South America mostly becomes more depleted over time, but really you could think of that as becoming less enriched over time. That's basically, I think, what is happening in these simulations, which is reflecting this regionally integrated increase in onshore moisture transport from an increasingly wide and westward shifted ITCZ and more strong easterly winds. I wanted to show this. There's a lot to unpack here, but I wanted to at least show that there are really major shifts in precipitation seasonality in Northern South America over this time period. And so it's not really enough to just look at JJA and DJF. A lot of the locations in Northern South America today actually have bimodal precipitation and are showing in the early Holocene that they were unimodal. Or vice versa. So there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff going on here. And I think that there's probably a lot to unpack in terms of how this ultimately affects the proxy reconstructions that are sensitive to hydroclimate. So the point of all this is to say that this canonical response of the ITCZ shifting south over the course of the Holocene is maybe a little bit tricky. We do see this sort of canonical response during hosing, especially during these sort of millennial scale events, where we see what we kind of would expect. The ITCZ shifts south, land-based precipitation also shifts south. It dries out the entire continental interior of Northern South America during June, July, August, and it really strengthens subtropical precipitation during September through May. In the early Holocene, we see this enhanced South Atlantic subtropical high and a drier Western Atlantic, which essentially starves the continent of this really key moisture source, especially for Northern South America. This is, again, out of the monsoon region, where there are other dynamics that are allowed to bring moisture onto the continent regardless. In the late Holocene, we see that South Atlantic subtropical high relaxing, the Western Atlantic gets wetter, the winds turn westward and bring more moisture onto the continent. And Northern South America, as a consequence, sees increased continental rainfall and decreased precipitation delta D, despite what might be occurring with local P-E. So soon, I will have access to the Trace Holocene experiments, and we'll be able to actually look in this in much more detail with a transient simulation, which is going to be really helpful. We're starting to play around with some water tagging. There are, I know, some higher resolution LGM experiments that John has told me about that I'm excited to check out. And then as part of a career award that I recently had funded, we're going to be generating some new records from Central America and Northern South America to try to kind of put this all into a model framework. Okay, so I will happily take questions.
Thanks so much, Bronwyn. We have time for 2-3 questions.
Questions in the room?
Sorry, John, I can't hear you.
Oh, maybe can I ask one question?
Oh, go ahead.
During El Nino La Nina events, what's the hydroclimate look like in South America?
Yeah, do you mean in the model or in like today?
Modern day climate
observations? Yeah, it's complicated. So yeah, it's complicated. It actually depends on the precipitation seasonality of each of the sites. So in some places you see that El Nino years are a little bit wetter, and others you see it's a little bit drier. And at Tota, it also depends, at least in the observational time period, it actually depends on the El Nino, which is really frustrating. There is this sort of like overall belief, I think, that El Nino events are drier in this part of Colombia. When you look at the data, I'm not actually sure that bears out. So I'm still trying to piece together some of that. It's a good question.
Great. I think there's a question from the audience, Suzanne Heller. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was going to ask a question about the handshake idea with like that ITCZ kind of separating, because that I feel like is kind of a new way to think about ITCZ dynamic. Like you think about latitudinal position or like how, I don't know, like the seasonal modulation, but like actually being like kind of a PC ITCZ. Like, have other people seen this before? Does this also happen in other parts of like the world during this period of time, or is it kind of more of an Atlantic only thing?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't know. I made up the handshake description, so if you don't like it, or if you do like it, I can get credit. And if you don't like it, then pretend somebody else made that term up. So I struggle a lot, as those of you who know me know, I really struggle a lot with describing land-based precipitation as the ITCZ, because there's just so much other stuff going on. And so over the course of the Holocene, I think if you look at the Western tropical Pacific, for example, I think we do have a lot of nuance going on that is not just a southward shift of the ITCZ. And I think that I don't know, the handshake thing I think doesn't quite work as well there, because we're not looking in, like, Indonesia isn't like a gigantic singular landmass, right? And instead we have a lot of like little focal points for precipitation over the islands. Africa would be the other place to look, and we don't exactly see the same thing in these model simulations, but again, there's different dynamics happening there because of the Indian Ocean. So I don't know if this is specific to South America, but I will say that I have tried really hard to find other records, proxy records, that look like Cariaco in the way that we expect. And Cariaco is really unique. It's really hard to find other records that look like Cariaco. It's not to say that that's wrong. I'm just saying it's like a very unique record, and it's sort of difficult to figure out exactly what it is telling us in terms of the winds versus runoff coming from the continent and where exactly it's coming from and all of that. I think there still is some nuance to think about there.
Thank you. For the sake of time, we have to move on. Thanks for the great talk, Bronwyn. Our next speaker is Nick Styler, who is going to talk about atmosphere-only simulations over the last millennium constrained by proxy. Nick, please feel free to take it away.
Hey everyone, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect, thanks.
Oh, sorry,
Okay,
Dominic.
yeah, I'm Dominic. Sorry, what's that?
Sorry, I said your name wrong.
Oh, all good, yeah. I'm Dominic Stiller. I'm working with Greg Hakem and Kyle Armour at the University of Washington, and I'll be presenting these atmosphere-only simulations over the last millennium that we've recently ran. And the main reason we're running these simulations is to learn more about the energy imbalance of the last millennium. So just to give a quick overview of what the energy imbalance is, it's defined at the top of the atmosphere, where we have incoming solar radiation, some of which is reflected right back to space. And then we also have outgoing long-wave radiation. And these approximately cancel each other out, but usually a small imbalance remains. And if this energy imbalance is positive, that means that the Earth system is gaining energy, and such energy gain then manifests as rising temperatures, an enhanced hydrological cycle, rising sea levels, and a changing cryosphere. And to understand this energy imbalance, we can separate it into the forcing and the response. So the forcing is independent of the surface temperature, and it's, for example, due to a volcanic and orbital forcing. And the radiative response, or the feedbacks, they do covary with the surface temperatures. Often we describe it as covariing with the global mean temperature, this T bar here, and the relationship is described by this climate feedback parameter lambda. But today we'll also see how the pattern of temperatures, and not just the global mean, is important. Now, this energy imbalance of the last 20 years or so has been positive at around +1 watt per meter squared, with an increasing trend, which we know from satellite observations. And it's an open question how much of this is anthropogenic versus natural variability, and how unprecedented this positive energy imbalance is in the context of natural variability. So this really is the main motivation for running these last millennium simulation, which is to provide context for the recent energy budget trends through natural variability, which we define as pre-industrial or pre-1850 variability. So this motivates my science questions. Over the last millennium, how did the energy imbalance vary? What were the relative contributions of the forcing and of the response? And what controlled the time variations in the response? Usually for paleoclimate studies, we use coupled models where we just prescribe the forcing and the boundary conditions and then let the model figure out the atmosphere-ocean solution. And if we do this, there are a handful of problems that may arise. First, we might get actually the wrong temperature trend. So over the last millennium, proxies, which I'm showing here in gray, show a cooling trend over 850 to 1850 in the global mean temperature, while the CMAP6 last millennium simulations show either no temperature trend, that's these yellow lines here, or in the case of CSM2, it's actually warming strongly and thus contradicting the proxy evidence. But even if the coupled models were to get the temperature trend correct, they would still underestimate the radiative response, which we know from comparing large ensembles to satellite observations. So for energy budget studies, it can be helpful to use atmosphere-only simulations where we prescribe the sea surface temperatures and the sea ice instead of letting the model figure it out. and that allows the model to successfully track the energy imbalance. For example, here I'm showing the CSM2 atmosphere-only simulations and series satellite observations, and they do agree pretty well over recent decades. Another benefit of these atmosphere-only simulations is that we can separate the forcing and the response through specialized runs. So that's why today I want to present these transient atmosphere-only simulations over the last millennium from 850 to 2000, which we constrain at the surface by SST and sea ice reconstructions that come from proxies, and where we separate the forcing and the response. So just the agenda for today is how do we set up these simulations, then what did the forcing and the response look like, how were clouds controlled by SST patterns, and finally, how did this feedback parameter lambda vary? So for these simulations, we need an atmosphere-only model. We're using CAM6 in a 2-degree low-top configuration. And we then need to prescribe the SSTs and sea ice. We're prescribing a seasonally and spatially resolved reconstruction that's currently in review. It's coming from data simulation of a number of proxies. And so this reconstruction is really how the proxy information finds its way into our atmosphere-only simulation. And the other component are the atmospheric forcings, which we take from the CMAP6 last millennium experiments. And these include, for example, solar and orbital forcing, but also volcanic aerosols, which are, of course, important over the last millennium. For the volcanic aerosols, because we're using the low-top version with very simple chemistry, we can't prescribe emissions. So instead, we're prescribing the optical properties that were simulated by the Wacom coupled run in CSM2, which does have interactive aerosol chemistry and better resolved stratosphere. And we're prescribing these optical properties as 5-day zonal means, which is also done for the CSM2 low-top historical runs, as described in the CSM2 paper. And we then run 2 types of simulations. The first one is similar to the AMAP simulations, where we have time-varying SSTs and a time-varying forcing. And the second type of simulation is the AMAP PI forcing type simulation, where we have time-varying sea surface temperatures, but a fixed atmospheric forcing. And then from these 2 simulation types to diagnose the effective radiative forcing, we can take the difference between these 2. And to diagnose the radiative response, we can just take these fixed forcing runs and subtract the climatology. And we can sample the uncertainty in the radiative response due to uncertainty in the SST reconstruction by prescribing an ensemble of SSTs. So just for some context before we dive into the simulation results, these are the global mean surface temperatures that we're prescribing. They have this canonical hockey stick curve over the last millennium with a slow cooling trend into the Little Ice Age, and then this strong historical warming. And the reconstruction agrees pretty well with the Pages2K multi-method, multi-proxy reconstruction. So if we prescribe these temperatures from the data simulation reconstruction for our CAM6 atmosphere-only simulations, we get this energy imbalance. So this is the energy imbalance anomaly relative to 1850. And a negative energy imbalance here means that we're losing energy. And indeed, we can see that over most of the last millennium, we have a negative energy imbalance, which is associated with this long-term cooling trend. We see there's quite some interannual variability, especially when there's volcanic spikes, but we're mostly going to focus on the 20-year low past ones today. We can then separate out the forcing, and that's of course dominated by the volcanic forcing of the last millennium. But this time series allows us to, for example, drive simple models such as FAIR. And the second component is the response, which is similarly negative, and in some cases even more negative than the forcing itself. So it contributes more to energy loss. And integrated over the whole last millennium, the response actually contributes 43% to the energy loss over 850 to 1850 that is associated with this millennial scale cooling trend. For the rest of this talk, we're only going to focus on the radiative response. And just for the sake of completeness, I want to show what the individual ensemble members are doing. So we're running 6 ensemble members, and for most of the plots here, I'm showing the ensemble mean, but there's actually quite some ensemble uncertainty, both to the different SSTs that we're prescribing, which are all realistic, but also even for the same SSTs, there's atmospheric internal variability, which creates spread in the response. We're now going to focus again on the ensemble mean radiative response over the last millennium, which looks like this with 30-year running means. And we now want to explain why the response looks the way it does. And so usually we take this scaling of the global mean temperature using this climate feedback parameter lambda. And if we fit a linear regression for this equation, we can see that it actually captures most of the response pretty well, both in the long-term trend and a lot of the multi-decadal variability. But at least during the Little Ice Age, we can see that there's an offset that this simple relationship can't fully explain. And so we now need to take a step back and see how actually the sea surface temperature patterns and not just the global mean temperature controls the radiative response. And the mechanism here, which is called the pattern effect, is mainly concentrated in the Eastern Pacific low cloud decks. And so the way this works is that if we have low clouds in the East Pacific, in the North and Southeast Pacific that reflect shortwave radiation, and the low cloud amount is controlled by the inversion strength. So weaker inversion means also weaker low clouds. And this inversion strength is set by both the local SSTs below, which set the local temperatures, but also by the temperatures of the free troposphere above, which are set in the West Pacific through deep convection and remote tropospheric warming. So really the low cloud amount in the East Pacific is controlled by the temperature contrast between the West and the East Pacific. And so to quantify this temperature contrast, we define this pattern stability index, which basically just tells us how much warmer the West Pacific is than the East Pacific. And we're using these regions, they're pretty broad, and we just take the average sea surface temperatures in the yellow box minus the average in the blue boxes. So going back to explaining the radiative response, before we saw that the global mean temperature itself has some deficiencies, if we now add in this pattern stability index to the mix, we can actually explain 99% of the variance in the response, and this discrepancy in the Little Ice Age goes away. So this shows that really low clouds are contributing to the global mean radiative response. And just to see what's actually what this pattern stability index actually means physically, we can regress a couple of physical fields onto this pattern stability index. So if we regress sea surface temperatures onto this index, we get this basin-wide IPO-like pattern of sea surface temperatures, which then are associated with low clouds. So a positive pattern stability index is associated with very strong positive low cloud anomalies in the Northeast Pacific, which then has a strongly negative energy imbalance there as a result, because we're reflecting more shortwave radiation. So this is one perspective on the pattern effect, where we kind of have a fixed feedback parameter lambda, and then we add like an explicit term to quantify the spatial pattern of SSTs, and that's used in the literature. But kind of a complementary perspective on this is to omit this explicit pattern effect term and rather think of the feedback parameter that scales the global mean temperature as time varying, which is also found in the literature. And so we're now going to take a few minutes to look at the second perspective. To get this time varying feedback parameter, we can take the equation that we already saw before of the energy imbalance, separate into forcing and the response. And if we then take the PI forcing runs, where we have essentially no forcing, we can rearrange this equation for lambda, and we can then find lambda as a linear regression. So just as an example, we have a period of global mean temperature and global mean energy imbalance without forcing. And if we now take, say, a 30-year slice and do a linear regression of the temperature versus energy imbalance in this period, we get the slope of the linear regression as a feedback parameter. And if we now slide this window over all of the last millennium, we get the time-varying feedback parameter. And that looks something like this. So we see that the mean feedback parameter of the last millennium was negative 1.5 watts per meter squared per Kelvin, which is very physically plausible. We also see that there's quite some decadal variability with pretty strong spikes. And we thought this might be associated with volcanic eruptions, because that's our preferred explanation of the last millennium. But actually, if we plot the distribution of the same quantity from PI control runs with the same model, where we also have no forcing, we actually see that all of these spikes in the feedback parameter are consistent with internal variability. So there's likely no forced explanation for these changes in feedback parameters. I finally want to make the case for why transient atmosphere-only simulations can be useful for paleoclimate, even though so far only really time-slice atmosphere-only simulations have been used. So first of all, they're much cheaper than coupled simulations, and that allows us to run large ensembles. So here I ran 12 ensemble members pretty easily. They're about a factor 10 cheaper than the coupled CSM2 last millennium simulations. They're very useful to investigate seasonal to millennial atmospheric variability, but constrained by proxies. So we know that we get the surface temperatures right. We can separate the radiative forcing in the response, and also these directly extend the historical AMIP simulations. The disadvantages are that, of course, this is limited to time periods where we have high resolution proxy data, so ideally interannual or higher resolution. So for the late Holocene, this is useful. And further, the volcanic cooling on the surface is underestimated in proxy reconstructions because the proxies smooth out the volcanic cooling, but also that means that the radiative response is then underestimated. On the other hand, coupled models likely overestimate the volcanic cooling, so there's that too. And finally, these simulations are not very useful to study the absolute energy imbalance. It's more useful for energy imbalance anomalies because there's a large absolute offset. And with that, I'm leaving up the conclusions, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much for the wonderful talk, Dominic. We have time for a few questions. Let's see, Vince Super, who's asking raise hand from the audience. Go ahead, Vince.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ran. Hey, Dominic, nice talk. One question I had, it looked like when you showed the time series of the forcing and the response, that the response and the forcing were the same sign until you got to the most recent record. Am I misreading that plot? Like in the modern climate, it makes sense that you have a forcing and then the radiative response is kind of offsetting that forcing to stabilize the climate. But in the early period, it looks like the radiative forcing and the radiative response are working in the same direction. Have you thought about why they offset each other in the modern period, but then add together to create a larger imbalance in the early period?
Yeah, I think that would be mostly connected to the type of forcing. So I think the long wave greenhouse gas forcing is acting differently than the volcanic forcing. Yeah, but what's also interesting is that the relative difference between the forcing and the response is actually such that we're predicting a negative energy imbalance over the last millennium, which is of course, over the historical period, which is of course unrealistic. But yeah, I should definitely look more into the relative sign of the forcing and the response.
Okay, thanks.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, John.
Yep.
Great talk, Dominic. I'm wondering about the SST pattern in your data simulation product, especially the east-west SST contrast in your last millennium DA. How different or similar it is from the historical time period in the observation?
Yes, so we validate our data simulation reconstruction against ERSST and some other SST datasets, and we get very good correlations, both in the global mean SST, but also in the pattern, actually. So I think overall we get the west-east contrast right in our data simulation reconstruction. The problem is that the response is actually very sensitive to just small changes in this SST contrast. And so with our proxy reconstruction, we of course have large uncertainties. So I think one valuable perspective here would be to not just look at the ensemble mean, but also look at each ensemble member and see what it's doing. Although these results are robust generally across ensemble members, not just in the ensemble mean. So that gives us confidence that even if you have slightly different SSTs that are supported by proxies, we get similar results.
Just quick following up. in that sense, how unique is this increasing of SST contrast during the historical time period? If we start from the last millennial perspective, how unique is the recent change?
Yeah, I haven't really looked at how unique it is. I think one thing that we do see is that the relationship maybe kind of breaks down over the historical period. I don't think we can see it here too well because it's 30-year running means. But if you look at shorter windows, this relationship does seem to break down a bit. So maybe there's something that the modern forcing changes the pattern effect that we're seeing. But yeah, that's also something I still need to explore.
Thanks. Ryan, there's one question in the room.
Okay, go ahead. I can't see people in the room.
Yeah, we look like answers, so very interesting, Dominic. So kind of off topic, but I'm trying to understand. You showed the global mean temperature time series, and it kind of follows pages 2K with that cooling to about 1800. I remember a while back, there was the last millennium reanalysis online that really didn't show any cooling at all. So are there, over time, did your group and Greg's group decide that online reanalysis was not quite right? Because it doesn't show
No, so
at all.
yeah, no, that was definitely very puzzling in LMR Online and Perkins and Haykim 2021 why there wasn't the last millennium cooling trend. But in the LMR seasonal reanalysis that came out last year, Mangadal 2025, we do get this cooling trend. And so what we believe is that explicitly accounting for seasonal information and properly accounting for proxy seasonality really gives us the trend. But it's still unclear why LMR Online didn't show the trend.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because we know seasonal matters for a lot of what we do in paleo. So, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So next we have Aishu Hu, who is going to talk about Tip Map Ocean Experimental Protocol Phase 1, Tipping Dynamics of the AIMA. Aishu, are you in the room?
Yeah, I'll quickly share. Oh, okay.
Okay, for this tip map ocean experiment, the tip map ocean domain is led by Didier, myself, Laura Jackson, and then Natasha, and we have a liaison is Nicole. She is located at the pipe. Oh, it's over the word. Okay. First, I give an introduction to what is the tipping point. Whenever we talk about tipping point, that means a system it has two equilibrium states. Normally, this system will oscillate within one of these equilibrium states, but due to the internal variability or due to external forcing, which can push this system go over the tipping point and transition from one equilibrium state to another. So whenever this kind of system has a tipping point, we call this system is a tipping element. This tipping point modeling intercomparison project and currently is led by Ricardo Wickman and started in late 2022, I think early 2023. And we had the first kickstart meeting in Germany in late 2023. During that time, the focus of this project is 6 area. One is Greenland ice sheet, Antarctic ice sheet, boreal forest, tropical forest, AMOC, and permafrost. But over the time between 2023 and 2024, there's a lot of changes and discussions, and finally, the overall scope of the project is expanded, and it becomes well-defined after the General Assembly of 2024. The headquarters of this project is at Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. And overall, this project is funded by the Europeans. And we will have a second General Assembly in early March 2026 in Tokyo. The risk question for this project is mostly 6. First is what is the risk causing one or the multiple tipping points in our climate system or Earth system? And what are the key feedback processes which can put the system go over a tipping point? The third one is what are the characteristics and the temporal and spatial scales of this tipping point? And then the fourth question is if the tipping point is crossed, whether this process is reversible. And next one is how this tipping point interact with themselves and also interact with other components within the Earth system. And lastly is what are the uncertainty of the tipping point. The structure of the tip map is with the tip map head. Underneath it, we have 6 domains, which is tip map ESM, Earth system model, tip map axis, tip map permafrost, tip map ocean, tip map biosphere, and tip map regional. And tip map ocean priority we call ourselves tip map AMOC. So you can see that there's expansion of the overall scope. Underneath these 6 domains, there's another 2 domains which can cross all these 6. First one is the tip map what if. This originally is a part of the WCRP safe landing lighthouse activity. This one is proposed to study the tipping point has passed, but our model is incapable to simulate it. So we just assume this event had happened and we simulate what kind of impact it will be. The last one is called tip map data method and analysis. Basically focus on how we can detect the tipping behavior in the model simulation and how to explore the underlying mechanisms of physical processes. Right now is the tip map overall project paper has been submitted to the Earth System Dynamics, and it is under revision now. Most of the experiment currently proposed within tip map is kind of idealized. First, starting with this tip map ESM, it assumes we have a global mean temperature increase by 0.2 degree per decade. This is an emission-driven simulation. When the global mean temperature reaches 2 degree warming, we can branch this run, give a 0 emission for at least 50 years, and afterwards we can run a negative emission and to see whether the system will go back to the original by doing this. And the same for the 4 degree warming, and then 0 emission, negative emission. When there's a negative emission going down from 4 degree warming, we can, when it reaches 2 degree again, we can branch another run to test under different pathway whether the behavior of the climate system is the same. So this is the CESM result and the result from other models. From CESM, you can clearly see is for the global mean temperature, at least, that when the CO2 is rising, global mean temperature increase. When it's a 0 emission, it's basically stabilized, and the negative emission temperature goes back. On the other hand, if we look at the different pathway, it reaches 2 degree warming when the CO2 negative emission, and to run a 0 emission scenario, this pathway is definitely different from the CO2 ramp up phase. For other models, you can clearly see is although the global mean temperature increase is 0.2 degree per decade, but for different model, because the climate sensitivity is different, so to reach 2 degree and 4 degree warming, the total CO2 concentration in that model is different. At 2 degree and 4 degree warming, if we run 0 emission, you can see the behavior of the model is also different. Some model is show a temperature increase, some models show a temperature decrease, and some of the temperature almost do not change. But for 4 degree, most of the models show a difference. For the T-map ocean domain, and we have proposed 4 experiments. Oh, here I should acknowledge we have a previous domain lead is Wilbert Weir. He has contributed a lot to help design these 4 experiments, but he has to pull out from the leadership. This 4 experiment, experiment A is CO2 plus hosting. Experiment B is to consider the Greenland actually melting effect in the historical past and future projection. Experiment C is an expansion of the Northland hosting map project. And experiment D is a connection to the past or paleo. We run an experiment about the 8.2K event. This is the region where we put the freshwater forcing into our experiment. For experiment A and B, the freshwater forcing is put around Greenland, mimic the melting of Greenland sheet. And for experiment C, the freshwater forcing is added into the North Atlantic 50 north plus the Arctic. And for experiment D, the freshwater forcing is added into the Labrador Sea region. The experiment A design is we want to make a connection to the TIP ESM simulation. We have this standard ramp up with 0.2 degree increase global mean temperature per decade and 0 emission and negative emission. Corresponding to this scenario, we designed a hosting experiment. On top of this is we have freshwater forcing running up for the first 100 years from 0 to 0.1 or 0.3. And after 100 years, we will run 50 years constant freshwater forcing of 0.1 or 0.3. And then the freshwater forcing will ramp up with the same rate from 0.1 or 0.3 back to 0. And then we hope I want to run it forward for another 100 years to see whether the system will recover. This is the result from CESM2. And the left one is global mean temperature. We can see this is a CO2 ramp up, 0 emission, red line, and negative emission, the green line. From here, we can clearly see for the 0.1 and 0.3 hosting experiment, the global mean temperature is at 2 degree warming level. Actually, with the additional weakening of the AMOC, you can see here, the global mean temperature actually is increased about like 0.9 degree less. And when the negative emission starts and the recovery of the surface temperature to the pre-industrial level is also much quicker. And if we go all the way down to the using the negative emission without the freshwater forcing level, and the global mean temperature actually drop far below the pre-industrial level. In terms of AMOC, you can see this is the CO2 increasing phase, and this is the red line is the 0 emission, and the green line is the negative emission. Without the additional freshwater forcing, AMOC recovers and overshoots. With this additional freshwater forcing, we see the AMOC is collapsed early, actually weakening much earlier, faster, and then for the 0.3 actually stays in this weakened mode, but for the 0.1 forcing, it shows a recovery, but not fully recovered yet. For experiment B, what we want to do is we want to compare if we include Greenland acid melting in a historical simulation, whether it will have an additional weakening of the AMOC. The reason for us to propose this experiment is currently most of the coupled models, they do not have an interactive dynamic acid model. And for the future projection, we use the ACEMAP 6 result, which we include SSP 2.5, 126, and 8.5, 585. And this thin line is the ensemble average of the ACEMAP 6 projection. And this dashed line is the maximum melting of the Greenland sheet in the ASMAP6 simulation. What we propose here is run the same historical simulation and future projection of these scenarios, but with this additional Greenland actually melting, we can compare with the standard historical and the future projection simulation to isolate the impact of Greenland actually melting. For experiment C, here is the expansion of the NA host map result. But for the NA host map, we run the simulation under pre-industrial condition at 0.3 story of freshwater frozen in the North Atlantic plus the Arctic for at least 100 years. At year 50, the freshwater frozen switch off to 0 and run the simulation for at least 50 years to see whether AMOC will recover. Previous results show that about half of the model, the AMOC recovers, the other half does not. To explain this simulation, we're building on the TMAP ESM simulation. We want to run another experiment under the same setup, but at different global mean temperature level, which means we use the 2-degree warming level and branch the simulation at some point during this time. So we can compare how this different mean state will affect the AMOC response. The last experiment is we want to build the connection between the modern day and the past. Here, we propose a simulation mimic the 8.2K event, but we use the pre-industrial condition. The freshwater frozen ramp up in 50 years to 0.3 or 0.6 virtual. Then another 50 years ramping down. Then we run another 100 years with 0 freshwater frozen. We also consulted with the PMAP, which they are going to run this Holocene 9.2K as a background control state. Then they will run the same Holocene 8.2K 0.3 and 0.6 virtual. It's exactly the same as what we propose here. By comparing the TMAP ocean experiment D and the PMAP simulation, we can isolate what is the background, the mean state difference contribute to the response of the AMOC. Okay, and here I show the modeling group who has showed interest to participate in this effort. Before the end, I want to advertise a couple of things about Pages. Pages is a global change, past global changes, as most people know, and currently it is jointly funded by the Swiss Academy of Sciences and Chinese Academy of Sciences. Pages is also a member of Future Earth and also a member of the WCRP. Currently, Pages steering committee co-chairs actually is Shilin and Martin, and Pages IPO director is Maureen France. Pages established in 1992, and the first sense scope they say is that they want to extend the paleoclimate research from local to regional and to global. In the second phase, basically want to give a more standard methodology to deal with the paleoproxy data and also including the modeling. For the third stage, Pages becomes really an interdisciplinary research. It covers not only the climate, it's also including the environment and human. For the first phase, currently it is also expanding this interdisciplinary approach. And Pages is the work is carried out by the different working groups, and these working groups is a group of people. They feel like there's a certain research question need to be tackled by a group of people, so they send a written proposal to Pages SSC to generate these working groups. And all these working groups also include a early career scientist network. For Pages Science Steering Committee, currently there's 15 members, and each year there's a certain number of members will rotate up. Every member can serve on the committee for 2 terms, 6 years. And every year there's always, we need new SSA members. And if you are interested in SSA, you can send the application through this link, and the deadline is March 11th. 2026 is about 1 month from now. And I think as Paige, as they say, really need more involvement from the North America scientists, and of course also scientists from everywhere of the world. And this is the group picture and taken at the 2025 Open Science meeting of the Pages. This is the current chair, and this is another. And the previous chair is Li Pingzhou. Lastly, I want to advertise another a new Pages working group which focus on the tipping point. It's called Investigating Most of Parts of Abrupt Climate Change and Tipping Points. The first working group workshop will happen at the May 11 to 13th, 2026 at University of Bern, Switzerland. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aifu. We have time for a few questions. I see Betty in the audience. Go ahead, Betty.
I asked what I should kind of know it, but you surprised me with one of your slides. So there's a lot of discussion, paleo, present, future, about whether the AMOC collapses. How is that defined in TIPMIP? Because your slide didn't agree with one I've seen before.
Yes, within the TIPMIP ocean domain, we had quite a few meetings discuss how to define AMOC collapse. And right now is we are not really agreed on how to define this. And in the practical paper, we try to avoid to use this kind of word which is not well defined. And right now is a couple of discussions. One is to define AMOC, which is 12 Georgia below, or 80% below the pre-industrial control simulation. And the other way we're talking about is to define the AMOC, we should say collapse, we should say significant weakening, is the AMOC is weakened by more than 3 standard deviations of the PI control. But of course, all these definitions, they have their deficiencies depending on the model, such as some models will have large variability, then your standard deviation will be larger. Some models have smaller standard deviation, you have a smaller AMOC change, you can define significant change.
It looked like you define it at the rapid latitude rather than the SPG, which is 45 north.
That's also a good question. And right now, I think at least for recent 10 years, and people tend to define AMOC at 26.5 north. The reason for that is we have a rapid observation, and rapid observation is long enough to give us something, although it's not really long enough to define whether AMOC is changing or not. Yeah, here, like the figure I showed, I used the maximum, which is mostly happening between 30 to 40 degree north. But if we use the 26.5, the number will be a little bit different.
Thanks for the discussion. For the next, we have Sylvia D, who will talk about the water. Sylvia, are you there? Who's going to talk about the water isotope model in the comparison project, WISO-MIP, first results, and a call for community engagement. Please take it away, Sylvia.
Okay, great. If you can just let me know if the right screen shows up here.
Not yet. Wait.
Yes?
Looks good.
Okay, great. I can't see any of you, so if you to get my attention, you'll have to speak up. So thanks. I'm going to give you all a little bit of a break for your brains after lunch, because I'm really not going to be talking about much science or dynamics here. I'm just going to give an overview of our water isotope model intercomparison group, our working group, and let you know what we've been up to and why, and also hopefully convince those of you who are not water isotope enthusiasts to join our efforts. And I know many of the people who are here today have been working on this project, and thanks especially to Zhang, who's been especially involved. So we know that water isotopes are really powerful tracers of the hydrological cycle. Water isotopes fractionate during phase change, and nature is lazy. We have heavy species of hydrogen and oxygen isotopes and the H1 and O16. And moisture in the atmosphere tends to retain a fingerprint of its origin, which allows us to fill in some gaps in our understanding about how the hydrological cycle is responding to climate change in the past and in the future. And we think of the classic water isotopes being maybe a history of rainout or temperature, but there's also been quite a lot of research over the last 20 to 30 years about how isotopes are sensitive to convective processes. There's really interesting work going on using water isotopes to look at tropical cyclones. So on microphysical scales, we can say something and perhaps use measurements to constrain these processes in our climate models. And then on regional scales, of course, we've seen that the processes such as continental moisture recycling or changes in the monsoons or moisture source can be captured with these powerful tools. And so one of the ways to advocate for the use of water isotopes in our climate models is that depending on, or no matter rather, if you're looking at small time and length scale processes like cloud processes or rainfall characteristics at the bottom left of this figure, or long-term decadal to century scale climate variations at the top right, water isotopes have archives on Earth that can capture these processes in time and space. So in the modern, we have satellite flyover data as well as in situ capturing of water isotopes and precipitation and vapor. And in the past, and in paleoclimate, we have isotopes in wood, corals, speleothems, ice cores, and lake and marine sediments. So there's really no shortage of information that water isotopes can provide. Just three quick examples from the left side of this figure going from decadal to century scale climate variations all the way down to cloud processes. I want to highlight some of the important projects that have been going on, again, over the last several decades, using water isotopes to close gaps in our observations and also our understanding of the water cycle. So on the global scale and on paleoclimate timescales, this is a figure that Bronwyn produced for the ISO2K project, which is a compilation of all of the last millennium water isotope-based proxy records. And all I wanted to show is wealth of data from many different proxy types that capture oxygen and hydrogen isotope ratios. And we've learned a tremendous amount from these archives, from changes in monsoons in speleothem calcite. We've learned about polar temperatures and polar moisture processes, as well as tropical hydroclimate and vegetation dynamics. So I know this group is well aware of the many applications of these proxies. If we zoom into the tropical Pacific, we've learned a lot about the Walker circulation and the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and increasingly the Indian Ocean and the Madden-Julian oscillation from water isotopes. And so we know, for example, based on work from Jessica Mormon, which is now older than I'd like to admit, that if we look at the regression on the top left here of the water isotopes from a cave in Borneo against daily trim rainfall, we get this beautiful pan-tropical Pacific signal of ENSO. And if we just take the precipitation alone at that site and regress it on daily precipitation across the basin, we see no relationship at all. This gives us I really love this figure because it just shows that water isotopes are not just capturing local precipitation, they're showing us what's going on across the entire tropical Pacific. And we can use the water isotopes in vapor as well. This is work from Adriana Bailey showing that in the mid-troposphere, we have vapor isotope ratios, the hydrogen isotope ratios, which also give us a clear imprint of changes during La Nina and El Nino. And then finally, the last little example, going down to the daily scale and the very local scale, cloud processes, I think there's enormous potential to try and improve our parameterizations and models of cloud processes. And this is something that we've been working on a little bit in my group with many collaborators at NCAR, including Adriana and Jesse. And we've found that we can use these vertical profiles of water vapor isotopes to try to say something about how much mixing is going on between the boundary layer and the free troposphere and relate that to cloud cover. And so the TLDR of the beginning half of this talk is just that water isotopes, they're able to capture atmospheric variability over large time scales and large length scales in the past, present, and the future in the same units. So we have paleoclimate reconstructions, we have our global networks of observations, and we have a tremendous amount of satellite retrievals now that we can use to explore atmospheric processes. And we have our isotope-enabled climate models, wherein we put our water isotope physics and tracers to be able to relate this important water cycle information to our observations. And so actually back in 2019, when we had a CLIVAR working group on water isotope meeting in Boulder, we came up with a number of ideas for how we can advance water isotope and paleoclimate research. And I'm just going to talk quickly about these last two. So building big databases that are machine readable and publicly available. And then secondly, using water isotopes to refine model physics. So specifically on this number 6, that requires we put our water isotope tracers in models. And that is what has motivated our latest MIP project, WISO-MIP. So in order to accomplish this last goal, to leverage water isotopes to refine model physics and use it for tuning, we've initiated WISO-MIP, which is formerly SWING, the Stable Water Isotope Intercomparison Group. We all know in this room that PMIP and CMIP experiments are regularly completed, but the last time that we had a MIP devoted to water isotopes was 2012. So it's been over a decade, and it's about time that we carry out this new MIP for water isotope-enabled models. And right now, we're in year 2 activities for 2 joint efforts. One is the Water Isotopes and Climate Network, which is really focused on building an observational platform that merges all the water isotope observations we have. And then the companion activities are this WISO-MIP, which focuses on intercomparison of isotope-enabled model experiments. So there are many, many groups, again, many of us in this room that are running isotope-enabled models. The most recent versions of many of our coupled or atmosphere or ocean models have isotopes in the ocean, in sea ice, in the atmosphere. So this is just a table from our previous CLIVAR working group report of some of the different isotope-enabled models that are out there. This is not an exhaustive list, but we have everything from EMIX, so intermediate complexity fast physics models, all the way down to cloud resolving and large eddy simulation isotope-enabled model. And we wanted to come together, so we have a few working groups. We have an experiment family that's actually now published by Haoyang Bong at NASA. He's a postdoc there, which is Nudge to Era 5 reanalysis. We have a paleoclimate working group, a high CO2 or future simulation group, and we also have a high resolution in space working group, although at the moment we're also working to compile high resolution temporal data at the 3 and 6 hourly scale for scientists who need that for various applications. You can see the list on the right of the different modeling groups that are participating, as well as some that are implementing isotopes now. So we have a pretty robust group of organizations that are involved, and we have monthly meetings, and everyone is welcome, which I'll mention in just a minute. So just a couple of our ongoing activities, as I mentioned, are, I think it's 7 different models that have nudged simulations from 1979 to 2025 are now published in JGR atmospheres, and that data is publicly available. So it contains all of the, standard fields that are at the top of this figure 2 from Hao-Young's paper, but also, the water isotopes and precipitation and vapor and precipitable water. So those are now fully available for scientific studies. For our paleoclimate working group, we have sort of a volunteer model where some groups already have simulations completed for all of these time periods on the left, which you can see is, I think, most of the ones we usually do. And then on the right, we're planning to try to hit these targets with some of the groups. Not everyone will be able to participate in all of these simulations, of course, but our goal is to mirror PMIP as best we can and to do some targeted experiments that will capitalize on the isotopes. And then finally, we have our future and high CO2 working group. These experiments, as well as the paleoclimate experiments, are being planned now. So we're actually working, Zhang and I and many others are working on writing a geoscientific model development paper to describe these experiments and put it out into the community so that other modeling groups can participate. So we're starting with some AMIP style runs. We're planning to do some patterned SST experiments, which we've heard a little bit about today. You'll see some that will mimic the CMIP6 DEC experiments as well. Finally, the WISO-NET twin, our observational, I don't really know that I have a full understanding of what digital twin means. This is not that, but the observational partner to WISO-MIP will be a database that is trying to merge, and I apologize, it's a big, busy figure, but if we go from the sky to the ground, all of our satellite data that's been published from Tropomi, Skimaki, GOSAT, YASI, TESS, CRIS, and AIRS, all of our precipitation values from GNIP, everything from NEON, the Global Network of Isotopes and Rivers, ISO2K, and other isotope paleoclimate databases. And then also the seawater observations that we have. So we're really trying to make a big community push to just have an air traffic control website where we can host all of these databases in one place and make them accessible to the community. We have another scientific goals. I won't go through these in too much detail, but we're interested in tracking changes to the water cycle, climate sensitivity, time of emergence, climate variability, air, land, sea connections with bioclimate feedbacks and transpiration. We're looking into how to use our models, or excuse me, our observations to better constrain atmospheric processes related to clouds and convection. And then there's a lot of really excellent work going on, again, amongst people at this meeting on extreme events like atmospheric rivers and tropical cyclones. And we also have a polar working group that's specifically focused on snow and ice data. So all of these are community-built initiatives and ideas. And really, at the moment, anyone can bring an idea to the table and make use of the data that we have. 2 quick examples. I know I'm running a little short on time, but I'm almost done. We have all of the comparisons with the nudge simulations. So this top graph here is showing pressure units on the y-axis and delta D in per mil on the x-axis, just comparing all of our isotope-enabled models to some of our satellite-based data. The goal here is to try to understand why the models don't match the vertical profiles of delta D that are in our satellite observations and try to improve their physics. And then we're also using the water isotope-enabled simulations to fill in climate variability. So this is another figure 9 from Hao-Young's paper, just showing the correlation, excuse me, the regression coefficients between all of these different indices, whether it's the NENI 034 or the AMO or the SAM, and the water isotopes in edge simulations. So you've seen or will see some of these QR codes later today. If you're interested in participating, I have these QR codes and they're also in the PDF talk that I uploaded. And there's also the ICESM user feedback survey. We have over 50 international participants in WISO-MIP, and 25 international participants in BISONet, and this is a completely open and volunteer-based project. So I'm very much looking forward to your feedback and participation if you can spare an hour here and there. So anyway, we are trying to use these water isotopes to constrain the water cycle in our millennia. If we can pair our observational network with our simulations, I think we can do some powerful science. And that's where we could go. And we gave some examples of that. And then I think there's some low-hanging fruit to try to look at anthropogenic-driven hydrological cycle changes, as well as design some isotope-based constraints on our physics to get a better handle on climate sensitivity. We also have a parallel working group with NCAR, SciSwim, to get isotopes into the latest and greatest of CESM. And so Zhang and I and our co-PIs, who are all listed at the top of this slide, are all actively working on this. So thank you very much. If you know anyone who's looking for a data scientist job, that would be great to know them. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Great, thanks for the great talk, Sylvia. Any questions from the audience for Sylvia? Okay, I think for the sake of time, maybe we'll move on. If you have questions, you know where to email Sylvia and the QR code.
Thank you.
Our next talk is going to be given by Sanju on emulating water isotopes in coupled Earth system models.
Thanks, Ren.
Starting.
All right. So, yeah, so my talk is about emulating water isotopes in coupled Earth system models. I will give an overview and some preliminary results of this project. It's analysis of the AIG collaborations between AI and the geosciences. It's collaborative research among NCAR, University of Maryland, and the University of Pittsburgh. And thanks to my collaborators listed here, including the PIs and the students. So, Julia just gave us a very nice introduction about why water isotopes are very important. So there are key traces of hydrological processes in the Earth system, from ocean to cloud to ice to river runoff and back to the ocean. And it tracks the processes across a very wide range of spatial and temporal scales. And the paleo records in specific can serve as paleo thermometers and rain gauges, providing real-world out-of-sample validation for our Earth system models. However, incorporating water isotopes into Earth system models is scientifically and technically challenging. It requires lots of modifications to the code base, including the dynamical core and the physical parameterizations. And it also adds about a 40% higher runtime computational cost. So this explains why we have the isotope capability in isotope-enabled CSM1, but not in 2 and 3. So John recently also got a project funded to incorporate isotope capability into CSM3, and it requires several scientists and engineers to work together for several years. So that's lots of resources required. So that's one of the motivations here of this project, why we want to do this. So we would like to develop a machine learning based emulator for water isotopes trained on Earth system model simulations and observation. And then once this emulator is trained, we'd like to apply it to other non-isotope ESMs so that we can generate the water isotope fields efficiently and cost effectively. And also, we can use this opportunity to improve scientific understanding of the leading drivers of water isotope variability, and so as to support the physically based development of the isotope-enabled ESMs. Also, we can contribute to the ongoing paleo DA efforts. So basically, if we want to assimilate water isotope records with model simulations, we will need that the prior model simulations to have that isotopic fields. Currently, we only have a few. So with this emulator, we can generate the isotopic fields for those existing available prior model simulations. So we can have a much wider range of the prior distribution estimate. So technically, we'd like to develop an emulator called isotope generator, IsoGen, for various water isotope variables like the precipitation delta 18, seawater delta 18, and delta D, and maybe some others. And eventually, we'd like to implement an online isotope generator into our assistant models to have those online emulation of those variables. So here we have three key scientific questions. The first one is what are the leading drivers of the isotope variability? And second is this climate isotope mapping relationship stable across different climatologies, like the cold house, cool house, warm house, and hot house? So this question is important because currently we interpret our climate isotope relationship based on modern climate observations, and then we use that interpretation to interpret our process records. However, if such relationship is unstable, sometimes may be different, you may have opposite sign of correlation, then the interpretation could be reversed. And third, we'd like to explore whether such mapping relationship is transferable across different system models. In other words, is this relationship sensitive to specific model physics? So this will affect our applicability to other models. And in this presentation, I will mainly focus on some preliminary results. Here we are using a single ESM ICESM 1.3 precipitation delta 18. So addressing question 1. And we also did some exploration on question 2. We tested whether we can do some prediction based on one climatology and predict the isotope fields in another climatology. So the state of the art of the precipitation delta 18 variability, it starts from this seminal paper that's called 1964. He proposed two fundamental effects. Temperature effect means the positive delta 18 and temperature correlation dominant in mid to high latitudes and high altitudes. The second is the amount effect, means the negative delta 18 and the precipitation correlation dominant in tropical and monsoon regions. So these correlations are detected locally. And later, these two studies suggest that this amount effect is mainly a result of the larger scale atmospheric circulation. And so they are highlighting the non-local nature of these isotopic controls. And later, Moment et al. 2013, they studied a national park, Mulu, and they look at the correlation between delta 18 and the precipitation across different scale of time and the spatial scale. So here, tree is graded data, and Mulu is a site data. So here we see that if we average the data with longer time scale, we have a better correlation. And if we compare this local correlation and the graded, so graded average, graded cell average correlation, we see that a better correlation if we look at the larger spatial average. They also note that the OAR, which is linked to convective activities, are also important. We see some correlation with what isotope. And later, this Nature Journal Sciences paper proposed another theory in addition to the two fundamental effects. It's the stratiform fraction. Basically, they calculate the ratio between the stratiform precipitation and the total precipitation, and they found a very good correlation against delta 18 in precipitation based on 26 sites. However, later, Conti et al. 2019 then summarizes all these theories, and they proposed this statistical model considering larger scale hydrological processes. So they suggested that the precipitation delta 18 is related to the rainfall evaporation, moisture flux, the direction of the moisture transport, and the stratiform rainfall fraction. So based on this theory. However, 8 years later, in this Science Advances paper, they just deny the stratiform fraction theory based on more observations. So here in this column, they are just repeating the analysis in this 2016 paper. They found that, yes, indeed, there's a good correlation between stratiform fraction and the precipitation delta 18 based on the selected sites. However, once they add more sites into the analysis, the correlation gets weakened a lot. Eventually, you don't see that. However, they found that the OLR related to the convective activities seems to show a very stable correlation with delta 18, even when you look at more and more sites. So that's I think that's the latest conclusion. And then there's another avenue of the research. This one, they studied the 20 stations, their monthly data, and they suggested that this originally we think is linear correlated, but this analysis shows that the relationship could be nonlinear. The upper panel shows the correlation between temperature and delta 18, and the bottom one is precipitation and delta 18. And for temperature, here we see for some sites like the Hong Kong station, the sign of the correlation is actually negative. It's different. So here, my impression of this literature review is that the leading drivers of precipitation delta 18 isotopic controls tend to be non-local, non-linear, and non-trivial, meaning that it's non-trivial, meaning that it's not as simple as temperature and the total precipitation. There could be more different contributors. So here we are using machine learning experiments to explore this question. We are trying to learn the climate isotope mapping. Basically, we are fitting this function using machine learning models and gain some scientific insights. Our strategy is to fit this model, this function using different input variables. And here we are using a neural network called Fourier neural operators. The motivation is actually very clear. So this model is very similar to the very famous evolutional neural network, which extracts, another word is CNN. So it extracts the spatial pattern and do some mapping. However, that convolution computation is relatively expensive. So Fourier neural operators do a similar spatial pattern extraction in the Fourier space. So where the expensive convolution becomes very cheap for multiplications. And we also have another paper led by our student. It's a benchmark of multiple deep learning models for water-isotope emulation. So we are just using the very basic temperature plus total precipitation as our model, but we compare the different neural networks, and then we find that FNO shows a very stable performance. And here the dataset we are using is the ICSM 1.3 simulations of the Miocene climatic optimum case. We have two CO2 level cases, 1.5 times pre-industrial and 3 times. And another motivation why we choose ICSM 3 is that Hu et al. Suggests that ICAM5 is the only one that can simulate the stratiform fraction theory among other IGCNs. And for our test, we split our data into training set, validation set, and test set. So our tests are all out-of-sample tests. And we also perform in-distribution experiments in which we train the model on one climate regime and test it in the same climate. And we also do another out-of-distribution experiment. We train in one climate and test it in another. So here shows our preliminary results, the in-distribution experiments. I first do some diagnostics. I calculate the local correlation, so grid cell-wise, compare the surface air temperature and the delta rating in precipitation. We see pretty good correlation over land. It's positive, and also I should say it's high latitude, mid to high latitude. Now for tropical regions, it's actually a negative correlation. So again, this is model data. It might not be totally in agreement with observations. The lower one shows the correlation between precipitation and the delta rating. We see a pretty good negative correlation for tropical regions. We see some positive correlation for some land regions. And but correlation itself is not on the same level for as R squared here for prediction. So for prediction, if we like to get a good R squared, explain the variance, a good correlation is not enough. Here we see that we only get some good skills over high latitudes and some limited tropical regions. So this is a linear regression prediction serving as the baseline here. If we do a linear regression between precipitation and the delta rating, we see that we only have some skill in the tropical regions. However, if we use the FNO, the machine learning model, we see we have a wider range of better skill. And for precipitation, we are actually getting a much better skill over the globe. So here it suggests that taking nonlinearity and non-locality into account with this FNO fitting, it appears to be very effective, confirming the previous studies. So we should consider the nonlinearity and the non-locality if we want to predict this precipitation delta rating variability. And then we're also looking at other variables, like the OLR, the outward long wave radiation, which is linked to convective activities. We see a very nice looking global correlation, positive correlation And we also look at the stratiform fraction. Then we see a wide range global negative correlation. However, if we do the prediction with linear regression, we see we only have some skew in tropical regions. So indeed, this correlation, although they look nice, it's not a very high correlation. So once we use that for prediction, it does not provide very good prediction skill. It's a similar story for the stratiform fraction. We only have some skill over ocean. But then once we move on to the machine learning model, we actually see much better skill again. And overall here, it appears that the stratiform fraction tends to be more informative than OAR over ocean, or globally speaking. And then I also did some independent exploration looking at the stratiform fraction or larger scale precipitation, and also the cumulative precipitation. Looking at the correlations, we see some negative correlation here, and some opposite patterns over land and ocean. Using linear regression, we see some skew. And move on to machine learning model. This one actually produces a very good skew. So I think the stratiform precipitation appears to be informative using FNO, so taking the non-linearity and the non-locality into account. I'm not sure if there's an existing study looking at this variable. I tentatively call it stratiform amount effect. And then
1 minute left.
Sorry. Now let's just compare several results. The stratiform fraction theory, the stratiform amount effect, and also this one is combining total precipitation and the large scale of stratiform precipitation. It's similar to the idea to the stratiform fraction theory because explicitly we can calculate the fraction. This one is a combination of the temperature effect, amount effect, and the stratiform fraction theory. And here we see some regions with weak skills. We propose it looks like it's related to the region with persistent drought conditions. So in those regions, we have a yield-defined delta 18 variability. So far, I think a mixture of the temperature effect and amount effect and the SF theory is the best skill. Here we are looking at using this result. Our best result looking at the delta 18 variability of the Nino 3.4 region. This one is the raw output. This one is with seasonal cycle removed. Overall, we get a very good RMSE and correlation skills. This shows the climatologies, the annual mean and seasonal mean. This column shows the difference between prediction and choose. So the bias is very small. So it's a good performance. We also tried this out of distribution experiment. We use the model trend in one climate and do the prediction in another climate 3 times CO2. We get some weakened scale. And the essential challenge here is that we are given that these two climatologies show very different distribution of the variables. We are normalizing the test set in this climatology using the statistics from the trend set from this another climatology. So that could be numerically difficult for the model to do the prediction. But that's just our preliminary exploration. We are still working on this question. So to summarize, I think based on the exploration, I think it's very feasible to predict the precipitation diluting variability using machine learning emulators and apply it to different climatologies. And also, we are able to use this approach to gain some scientific insights. So it seems that non-linearity and non-locality is very effective, confirming other previous studies. And our current best emulator is mixing the theories mentioned in previous studies. And the weaker performance is related to the persistent drought conditions. For future, we will use modeling, observations, and machine learning techniques to study the scientific interpretation of this non-linearity and non-locality, as well as the stratiform amount effect. And we will also to improve all the out of distribution tests across different climatologies. Also, we are in collaboration with MIP, and I had CM3 to test our model across different ESMs, addressing our question 3. And we will also emulate other water isotope variables, like the seawater diluting in the ocean, which will be very useful for the assimilation of coral diluting records for PaleoDA. And yeah, that's it. Thank you, and happy to take any questions or comments.
Thanks for the very interesting talk and the really impressive progress on the project. And for the sake of time, if you have a question, please email Fen. So we'll have to move on to our next talk, our final talk by John, who's going to talk about a new set of recipes for CESM3 for near modern paleoclimate application.
Thank you, Ran, and thank you everyone for staying until the end. And feel free to go outside, grab some snacks and coffee, sparkling water. I know that this session is long. So my talk is about a new set of recipes for CSM3 for near modern paleoclimate applications. At the end, I will add some discussion slides to give you an update about CSM3 and the paleoclimate working group activities. I want to start my talk with this old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. So interestingly, this wisdom has been shared across multiple different cultures. And this wisdom is the reason for folks here at NCA trying to use recipes as a guidance for people, users to develop paleoclimate boundary conditions. That basically we need to learn how to fish in paleoclimate world. To give you a very quick example, assume you are a PhD student and you are tasked by your PhD advisor to study the ice sheet forcing on circulation, and say you take the boundary condition and the simulation setup, say from the NPA group, and then you run your simulation, you looked at your results, identify some interesting response in your circulation. Then you would like to dig deeper. What is causing this circulation change you see in the simulation? And as you can see from this illustration here, one very simple separation of the complicated process is this circulation change driven by the albedo forcing or by the topographic forcing? So we have a deeper question we want to address. To answer this question, you need to set up sensitivity simulations. Specifically here, one way to do that is you keep the topography in the CAM boundary condition file, and you replace the land cover in your land surface data with the pre-industrial vegetation. Basically, you have a green mountain. If you compare that sensitivity with this wide mountain simulation, you can separate the albedo effect from the topographic effects. So really being able to develop your own paleoclimate boundary condition setup sensitivity experiments is key to address interesting questions. And the old recipes have been there for decades, thanks to Heather and many others' effort. And they were designed for old house resolution model like CSM4, CSM1. And I'll give you a couple examples here. The land surface data generation process requires you to regrade the raw data land surface information into half degree. So immediately you lose the high resolution information. Second example, the current method to derive the subgrid scale roughness topography for CAM is outdated. Physically, it's inconsistent. It only works for lat-long grid. And the atmosphere group has moved towards the Lauritsen et al. 2015 method a long time ago. And with this new method, we can have more physically consistent subgrid scale roughness and it works for unstructured grid in high resolution applications. It works for the newer models as well. And the old recipes use some now outdated protocols and practices. For example, we know that NCL is no longer being developed, so we need to replace that with newer tools like Python. The old recipe used multiple language, has complex dependencies, scattered steps, sometimes lacks visualization, result checking, documentation. So here is a diagram taken from the old recipe. You can see we have multiple steps to develop all the boundary conditions, ocean bathymetry, mapping files, domain files, etc. And they are relatively nicely documented. And if you focus in one step, for example, here, the domain and the mapping files generation, you dig deeper, you see that, okay, this step, we have multiple sub-steps. And for each this sub-step, you need to carefully set up the input and output files in order for them to run correctly. So overall, this is, I think, error-prone. And here is another example. This is on the land surface data generation. You can see, again, multiple steps involves Fortran, NCL, and many steps, seashells. Here, I want to stress that this is not to criticize the old recipe. It has been there, served the community very well for several decades. And my PhD study, my postdoc studies, they all benefited greatly from workflows like this. And now it's just time, I think, to update those available tools. That's my motivation to develop a new set of a recipe for CSM3 LGM. So that's my way to give back to the working group. And the new recipe will support CSM3, newer models, and future high-resolution applications. I try to pay attention to backward compatibility whenever possible. It is written in Python, runs on Jupyter Hub, on Derecho or Casper, and sometimes you submit job on Casper on Derecho to run some Fortran executables. I think relatively streamlined workflow. I add a lot of inline documentation, extensive diagnostics, and visualizations. Before giving you a quick demo about the notebooks, I want to add a couple reflections here. First, paleoclimate is inherently complex. You deal with all the model components. Oftentimes, it requires us to consult with component specific manuals and guides. And usually it's research driven for specific scientific questions. It's not for operational prediction. So we really need to learn the the mechanisms about developing those boundary conditions. And as CSM becomes more complex, paleo recipes also need to evolve, and oftentimes they become more complex as well. During this process, priority is given on clarity and transparent decision making, and not on code elegance. I'm not a software engineer, and I'm brave enough to share my notebooks. And the recipe works with high resolution raw data, means sometimes it's very memory intensive, but it should be fine on Casper and the ratio. And I think very important thing we need to, I want to stress here is that we don't have a single perfect solution in many of the paleoclimate simulation development, partly because there are issues coming from the inconsistent data sources and inconsistent definition. And here the table just to give you an example. To generate topography for Cam 6, Cam 7, you need high resolution present day topography in 1 kilometer resolution. And you say that they don't give you a land sea mask. Instead, they give you a land water mask. And if you want to develop the bathymetry for MOM6, the ocean model, you use a slightly higher resolution, and the topography is in a different variable, different definition. And they don't give you automatically give you a land, sea, lake mask. So you have to derive that from this very high resolution data. And to develop the MOM bathymetry, it involves a lot of averaging, smoothing, and many manual edits. Those are for the modern climate. And if you want to take them to a paleoclimate application, so here, if we use the I6G data, you can see the raw data is from different data set at different resolution. And then you combine the information.
Seems this room is booked starting at 3 by effort.
Okay.
Yeah, so I thought we would wrap up soon.
We can't wrap up. Can we move?
I had asked them, but they said like the third.
No, can we move?
Oh, yes,
I
10
said
minutes,
the
10 minutes
chairman.
reserved for us, yes, yes.
Let's go to the chair.
Okay.
I'm so sorry.
Can we use the link, the Google Meet link?
Link, yes,
It's the same, or do we have?
no, we
any-
can,
Tell us online what we're doing.
Yes.
yeah.
Sorry, everyone, for joining online. This room is booked for 3 p.m. We have to move to another room.
But the Google Meet should. Yeah, I'm gonna fix
Okay.
it.
Can we, is this the same link that we can join?
Yeah, that's what.
They're saying it's the same link.
Yeah, that's what
Okay.
Elizabeth just said.
Okay, it's the same
Please
link.
join,
Scheduled to end.
please join using the same link.
Okay. So I guess we can stay on for